The mountain had always been there, watching us work with borrowed iron. Every beam we had rolled, every gear we had cut, every rail we had laid across the workshop floor, all of it had come from scavenged scraps, salvaged fittings, metal pried from the bones of things other people had already used up and abandoned. We had done extraordinary work with it, I knew that. But there is a difference between what you can accomplish when you are rationing every ingot and what you can accomplish when the ore comes to you by the ton, on your own rails, from your own mountain. I had known for a long time that we would eventually have to make that leap. The day we finally stood at the mouth of the old mine and looked into its dark throat, I felt the weight of everything we had built pressing at my back, urging us forward. Everything we built from scraps, I said to the team gathered behind me. No more. We opened the old mine, and we never run short of iron again. No one argued. They had all felt the shortage in their own way. Mokje rationing stock for the tool room, Teho banking his forge fires lower than he liked, Choyoung's apprentices learning to file a blank down to almost nothing before they were allowed to start over. The scarcity had sharpened us, now we were going to end it. I stood at the mine mouth alone for a moment before the others came up with the survey gear. The entrance was low and dark, timbered in the old style, most of the crossbeams rotted through and needing replacement before any of us would step 10 paces inside. The smell that came out of it was cold iron and wet stone and something older than both, the deep breath of the mountain itself, held for years. A mine took me out of one world and dropped me in this one. I had thought about that often, in the quiet hours between shifts, when the forge had cooled and the workshop was just shadows and the smell of oil. It seemed fitting then that a mine was where the real work began. Not the preliminary work, not the proving work, the real work, the kind that could not be undone. Yunsurin had come up the slope ahead of the rest, the way she always did when there was measuring to be done. She moved through the rock cuts with a lodestone in her hand, reading the face of the mountain the way I read a surface plate, looking for deviation, looking for truth, looking for the line that would tell her what everything else was trying to hide. This band pulls the lodestone, she said, pressing two fingers against a dark stripe in the exposed face, iron-rich and dense, running at a shallow angle into the hillside. Follow it. The pale seam isn't worth the timber to reach it. I crouched beside her and looked at the two bands side by side. The pale one was wider, more visible, the kind of thing an untrained eye would chase. The dark band was narrow and easy to miss. She was right, of course. Measure before you dig, I said, same as everything else. She did not look up from the rock face. She never needed acknowledgement when she was working. We spent the better part of that morning tracing the rich seam, marking its angle of descent, estimating where it widened and where it pinched. Seiren recorded everything in her ledger, strike and dip, color and grain, the lodestone's response at each sample point. By midday we had a map of what the mountain was willing to give us, and where it would make us work for it. Doguang had come up from the works walking carefully, his recovery still showing in the measured way he placed each step on the uneven ground. But his eyes were sharp, and his voice carried the same flat authority it always had when the subject was safety. He walked the perimeter of the mine mouth, then ducked inside far enough to read the state of the existing timbering, then came back out and stood with his arms crossed, looking at the crew. A mine kills the careless faster than any wheel, he said. There was no drama in it. He was simply stating a condition of the work, the way you state the boiling point of water. Timber every span. No one digs alone or tired. He laid out the reopening sequence, drainage first, because standing water in a shaft is a promise of collapse. Shoring second, every section checked before the next section opened. Air testing third, a lamp lowered on a cord before any man descended, watching the flame for the signs that the air had gone bad. The crew listened without fidgeting. Doguang had earned that kind of attention, and they knew it. The drainage work took 3 days. We cut a channel along the low side of the main gallery and let the accumulated water find its own way out, helping it along with a small pump Mokje had assembled from workshop stock. The water that came out was rust red and smelled of sulfur, and it ran down the hillside in a thin, bright line that stained the rocks below. The mountain bleeding out its old wounds, making room for us. While the drainage ran, Moksha's team was already at work on the infrastructure, the things the mine would need before it could feed the works, and the things the works would need to build to make the mine function. It was the kind of problem I had always found satisfying, a system that had to construct itself, each piece enabling the next. The rails came first. We had the pattern already from the workshop floor. Shop-made iron rail, spiked to hewn timber sleepers, laid in a gauge we had settled on early and held to ever since. The ore carts were simple, a welded iron box on four flanged wheels, a pin coupling at each end, a handbrake on a ratchet. The winch was more involved, a drum, a ratchet and pawl, a long handle for manual operation, with provision for a future power drive when we had the capacity to spare. Mokje built it the way he built everything, to the drawing, to the tolerance, with a kind of quiet stubbornness that refused to call something finished until it was actually finished. He was watching the first cart run on the new track when he said it, almost to himself, "The mine feeds the works, and the works builds the mine. It's like it loops." Choyoung was beside him, checking the wheel flanges against the railhead. She looked up with something that might have been amusement. "That's the whole trick," she said. "Everything we build helps us build the next thing faster." I heard them from across the cut and did not add anything. They had understood it themselves, which was better. The rockfall happened on the 8th day. We had opened a new section of the gallery, following the rich seam as it turned slightly and dropped. The timbering crew was 2 spans ahead of the dig crew, which was the correct order. But the mountain does not always respect correct order. A section of the upper face let go without warning. Not a catastrophic collapse, but enough to fill the gallery with dust and send loose rocks skittering across the floor in the dark. The crew came out. They came out the way Dogwang had drilled them, in order, without running, each man accounting for the man behind him. I was at the gallery entrance when they emerged from the dust, and I counted heads before I let myself breathe. Dogwang came out last. He stood at the entrance and looked back into the settling cloud for a moment, then turned to face the crew. "Out, calm and ordered," he said. "Rushing is how the second one dies." He waited. The dust thinned. "Everyone breathing?" They were, every one of them. "Reshore it and we go again." There was a pause, not hesitation, just the moment a crew takes to absorb a close thing, and then they went to get the timber. That was the discipline Dogwang had built into them, not fearlessness, which is just ignorance wearing a brave face. Discipline, the knowledge that the correct response to a dangerous thing is the correct procedure, applied without panic every time. The reshoring took the rest of that day. The section that had failed was rebuilt stronger than it had been. We went again the next morning. By the end of the second week, ore was moving. I stood at the top of the rail grade and watched the first loaded cart roll down under its own weight. The brakeman riding the handle, the wheels singing on the iron rail in a tone that was almost musical. The cart was not large. We had built conservatively, knowing the grade and the rail capacity, but it was full of iron ore, our iron ore, from our mountain, moving on our rails to our works without a single outside hand involved in any part of it. "From the mountain to the works without one outside hand," I said, to no one in particular. "That's not just iron. That's independence by the cartload." The cart reached the bottom of the grade and ran out onto the level siding beside the works. The brakeman set the ratchet and stepped off, and the cart sat there in the late afternoon light, patient and full, waiting to be emptied and sent back up for more. Sorin set up the Buffineshun station between the minehead and the works, a crushing stage, a sorting screen, a grading table where the ore was separated by quality before it ever approached the furnace. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that only reveals its value over time, when the furnace runs clean and consistent and the iron that comes out of it is predictable enough to build from. She ran the grading with the same precision she brought to everything. Each batch was assessed, sorted, recorded. The high-grade ore went to one pile, the mid-grade to another, the lean material set aside for a use we had not yet determined but would find. Feed the furnace the same quality every time, she said, checking a sample against the standard she had established on the first day, and it gives back the same iron every time. Surprise is the enemy of metal. I had said something similar to Mokshe once, about feed rates and cutting tools. The principle was the same. Consistency in, consistency out. Variation is where things break. Ji Young came up to the mine site on the third week, which surprised me. She did not usually leave the lower town without reason. She stood at the edge of the work area and watched the crews moving, the diggers, the timberers, the cart handlers, the sorters at the grading table, and her expression was something I did not have a ready name for. 3 months ago they were begging at the gate, she said. She was not speaking to me specifically. She was speaking to the fact of it, the plain visible fact of what had changed. You opened the door for every soul the court left for dead. I looked at the crews she was watching. She was right that most of them had come to Iron Ridge with nothing. The court had made its decisions about who mattered and who did not, and these people had been on the wrong side of that calculation. Now they were timbering a mine, grading ore, learning to read rock and manage a brake line and drive a cart on iron rails. They were learning things that would be useful for the rest of their lives, in ways the court had never intended to give them. I did not say anything to Wol Young. There was nothing to add. Taeho had been patient, which was not his natural condition. He had watched the ore accumulate at the grading station, watched the carts run, watched the beneficiation process sort the mountain's yield into clean, consistent feed, and he had said very little, which for Taeho meant he was thinking hard about something he was not yet ready to say out loud. He came to me on the evening of the 21st day, when the light was going gold, and the works below us were lit by forge glow and oil lamp in equal measure. He looked at the ore stockpile, which was substantial now, and then he looked at me. "Give me something that can drink," he said. The hunger in it was not metaphorical. It was the specific hunger of a man who has spent his life working a fire that was never quite large enough for what he wanted to do. A furnace as tall as a tower. I had been waiting for him to say it. "That's exactly what we build next," I told him. "You're going to pour iron like water." He looked at the stockpile again, and something in his face settled. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man who can finally see the shape of the thing he has been working toward. We had the ore. That was the fact I kept returning to as I walked the rail grade in the last light, watching the final cart of the day make its descent. We had the ore, in quantity, in consistent grade, moving on our own infrastructure from our own mountain. The scarcity that had constrained everything we had built, every gear cut thin, every casting made to stretch, every ingot rationed like medicine, that scarcity was ending. What came next was the fire to free the iron from the rock, at a scale we had not yet attempted, in a furnace that did not yet exist. The blast furnace, tall as a tower, hungry as Taofo had always been, capable of drinking ore by the cartload and giving back liquid iron in return. I looked down at the valley, at the works we had built from nothing, at the lights coming on one by one as the evening deepened. The veil over the town was pale at the edges, thinner than it had been when I arrived, doing what failing things do, holding on but only just. We needed to move faster than it was failing. That had always been the condition of the work. The ore was secured. Now we built the fire. The blast furnace was never meant to sleep. That was the first thing I tried to make Baektaeho understand, back when we were still drawing the stack on a scrap of oiled paper in the forge's back room, the charcoal brazier throwing shadows across our sketches. A bloomery is a fire you build and tend and let die. You coax iron out of it in fists, in blooms, one heat at a time. A blast furnace is something else entirely, a fire you light once and feed forever, a tower that breathes day and night and gives back iron by the ton. Ore and coke and limestone in the top, I told him, tracing the column with one finger. Molten iron and slag out the bottom, day and night. That's how you feed a civilization, Baek. He had looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. I had learned by then that his silences were not skepticism. They were the way a man who has spent 30 years listening to iron learns to listen to a new idea. The stack rose through the last weeks of autumn, and it dwarfed everything we had built before. The forge that had seemed so large when we first fired it now looked like a child's toy crouching at the furnace's feet. The masons worked from the base up, laying fire brick in courses, and I walked the scaffold with them every evening to check the joints. Line it thick, I told them, again and again, until it became a kind of refrain on the site. The only thing between that heat and the river is good fire brick laid right. The outer shell was fieldstone and mortared rubble, but the inner lining was the work that mattered. High fire brick from the kiln we had expanded in the summer, each course raked and checked, the whole throat of the furnace shaped to hold temperatures that would turn the stone itself to slag if we got the lining wrong. I had seen what happened when a furnace ran too hot against a thin wall. I had no intention of seeing it here. Mokje spent 3 days grinding and fitting the tuyères, the iron nozzles through which the blast would enter, and he fit them with the same obsessive care he brought to every piece of metal he touched. By the time the stack was capped and the charging platform was planked, the furnace looked less like something we had built and more like something that had always been there, waiting for us to find it in the hillside. The burden, the charge we would feed into the throat, had to be right before the first firing. Yun So-rin had taken that problem as her own from the moment I explained it to her, and she had spent 2 weeks at the weighing bench working through the ratios. Ore, coke, limestone. The ore carried the iron and the impurities both. The coke was the fuel and the reducing agent, stripping oxygen from the iron oxides as the heat climbed. The limestone was the flux, binding the gangue and the ash into slag that would float above the iron and pour off separately. The proportions were not arbitrary. They were a question the furnace would answer with the quality of its iron, but only if you asked the same question the same way every time. By weight, by ratio, written down, Se-rin said, setting her ledger on the charging platform the morning before the first firing. She had measured out the trial burden herself, basket by basket, and recorded every figure in her close, careful script. The furnace will teach us the recipe, but only if we feed it the same question every time. She was right, and she knew she was right, and she said it anyway, because that was how she worked, not from pride but from the conviction that the thing needed to be said aloud, recorded, witnessed. I had come to rely on that quality in her. It was the difference between a measurement and a record, and the record was what survived. The water wheel had been turning since the river rose with the autumn rains, and the great blower bellows it drove, double-acting, valved, built over the course of the summer, from seasoned timber and dressed leather, were ready. The blast system was the furnace's lungs. Without forced air, the fire in a stack that tall would choke on its own gases before it reached iron-making temperature. The wheel gave us the river's patience, translated into pressure, translated into heat. I stood on the charging platform the morning of the first firing and looked down at the water wheel churning in its race, the drive shaft turning, the cams lifting and releasing the bellows arms in their slow, relentless rhythm, water and air and fire, all pulling together. The furnace would breathe because the river never stopped breathing for it. Doguang had been on the site since before dawn. He was a quiet man, the safety master, not given to speeches, but he had spent the previous week marking out the safety line, a row of driven stakes and rope, set at a distance he had calculated from the furnace's volume and the worst failure mode he could imagine, and he had briefed every person on the crew about what lay behind it and what lay in front of it. Behind the line, he said, when the crew had assembled and the burden was loaded and the kindling charge was lit at the base. His voice carried without effort, the way a man's voice carries when everyone present is already listening. If she lets go, she lets go away from people. Now, open her up. The blast valves opened, the bellows arms began their full stroke, and the furnace, for the first time, began to breathe. The hours that followed were the longest of the season. The furnace does not give up its iron quickly on the first heat. The stack has to come up to temperature. The burden has to descend through its reduction zones. The chemistry has to run its course at every level of the column. We fed the throat from the charging platform at intervals, basket after basket of ore and coke and limestone, and we watched the gases burning off at the top shift from black smoke to a pale, almost colorless flame as the coke combustion found its rhythm. Teiho never left the furnace's side. He moved around it slowly, stopping to press his ear close to the shell, to watch the color of the flame at the top, to smell the gases coming off. He had spent 30 years reading bloomery fires, and I had wondered, privately, whether the blast furnace would be too large, too different, too much a thing of ratios and records, rather than the intimate conversation he was used to. I had been wrong to wonder. By mid-afternoon, he had already identified something the instruments had not yet shown us. "She's running cool on the east side," he said, coming to find me at the observation post behind the safety line. He said it the way he said everything, not alarmed, but certain. "More blast there." I looked at the tuyere arrangement on the east face and saw what he meant. The east side blast valve was fractionally less open than the others, a fitting that had settled during the morning's vibration. We adjusted it, and within the hour the flame color at the top evened out. He stood watching the adjustment take effect, and after a moment he said, quietly, almost to himself, "Gods, I'm talking to a tower of fire, and she's answering." I did not say anything. There was nothing to add. The first pour came at nightfall. I had tried to prepare myself for it, the way I had tried to prepare myself for the first time the water wheel turned, for the first time the lathe cut a true cylinder, for the first time the forge reached welding heat. I knew what was coming. I had the numbers, I had the process, and none of it was preparation enough. The tap hole plug, a cone of fire clay rammed into the iron notch at the furnace's base, was knocked out with a long iron bar, and the molten iron came. It came as light before it came as anything else. The night had been settling over the valley, the forge fires and the oil lamps making their small claims against it, and then the tap hole opened, and there was no more night. The iron ran in a river down the sand-cast channel we had prepared, and it was the color of the sun at the moment before it clears the horizon, not yellow, not orange, but a white that shaded into every warm color at once, and the heat came off it in a wave that you felt in your chest before you felt it on your skin. Mokse was standing 2 steps behind the safety line, and I heard him say something under his breath. I looked at him. His face was lit gold by the pour, and his expression was not the face of a man watching a technical process succeed. It was something older than that. "It's like the sun came down the mountain," he said, "and we caught it in a ditch." The iron ran on. The channel filled. The molds at the end of the channel, the pig beds, simple depressions in rammed sand, began to fill with iron that was still moving, still alive with its own heat, rippling at the surface the way water ripples when it is poured too fast into a still vessel. Then Mokche found his full voice. "We make iron like water now." He said it to no one and everyone, turning to look at the crew behind the line, his arms out at his sides, as if he were trying to show them the size of what was happening. By the ton. Chayoung was standing beside him. She had been quiet through the whole firing, the way she was often quiet, not absent, but present in a way that did not require noise. She looked at the river of iron in the channel, and then she looked at Mokche, and her voice when she spoke was soft enough that I almost missed it under the roar of the furnace. "Remember the forge, Jay? One little fire?" She paused. "Look how far the fire came." The pig beds filled. The iron cooled from white to yellow to orange to the dull red of a thing that has given up its heat but not yet its warmth, and the crew moved in, carefully, at Dogwang's signal, to check the moles and begin the tally. Tons, not blooms, not handfuls, not the careful fist-sized masses we had hammered out of the bloomery over months of work. Tons of cast iron, poured in an afternoon. I stood at the edge of the pig bed and looked at the rows of cooling iron, and I thought about the bloomery, the old stack, smaller than a man, that had been the center of everything we built for the first 2 seasons. It had served us, it had taught us, it had given us the iron we needed to build the tools, to build the furnace that had just made it obsolete. The bloomery would not be torn down. It would be kept, the way my grandfather kept the hand files he had learned on, not for use but for memory, like the grandmother lathe, like the first plate we scraped flat. The things that taught you did not stop being worth honoring just because you had outgrown them. Were past handfuls forever. Tahoe found me at the edge of the pig bed sometime after the second pour had finished, and the tat hole had been plugged again for the night. The furnace glowed above us, its stack radiating heat into the cold air, the gases at the top burning with a pale, steady flame. The valley below was lit by it, a dim, warm light that reached the tree line and stopped, the way forge light always stops at the edge of the dark. He had been crying. He was not embarrassed by it, and I did not treat it as something to look away from. There were never any gods in it, he said. He was looking at the pig beds, at the rows of cooling iron. It was just things I hadn't been taught yet. He was quiet for a moment. Look what we made. I had known Pectao since the early days, when the forge was a ruin, and he was a man who blamed the gods for bad iron because he had no other explanation available to him. He had not been wrong to look for an explanation. He had only been given the wrong vocabulary for the one he found. The furnace had given him a new one. I did not say any of that. I just stood with him and looked at what we had made. The honest accounting came later, when the crew had eaten and the first excitement had settled into the particular quiet of people who are tired in the right way. Cast iron is not steel. This is the thing that matters, and I had been careful to say it plainly before the firing, and I said it again now, because the distinction is not a small one. The blast furnace produces pig iron, cast iron, high in carbon, hard and useful for many things, but brittle in ways that steel is not. You cannot forge it, you cannot draw it into wire, or hammer it into a blade, or use it for a lead screw or a machine spindle. For those things you need to fight the carbon back out of it, to convert the pig iron into wrought iron, or further still into steel. That is a different process, a different fight, and it was not tonight's fight. To get steel, I said, we fight the carbon back out of it. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, we just watch it glow. The crew accepted this without argument. They were not disappointed. The pig iron was real, the tons were real, and there was enough work ahead for cast iron to fill months. Castings, molds, shapes we had not been able to make before because we had not had the volume of iron to fill them. That was Teho's next question, and he asked it with the furnace still glowing behind him, the valley still lit by its steady, patient fire. What do we do with a river of iron? Anything we can dream a shape for, I said. Tomorrow I'll show you how to make iron remember a shape. The furnace burned on through the night, tended in shifts, fed at intervals, breathing with the river's borrowed breath. From the far side of the valley, if you did not know what it was, you might have thought a star had come down and settled in the hills above Iron Ridge. A steady, warm light that did not flicker the way fire flickers, that did not die the way fire dies, that simply continued, the way a process continues when the conditions that sustain it are met and maintained and measured and recorded and met again. The idea had been sitting in the back of my mind since the first day I walked into Tahoe's forge and watched him beat a bar of iron into a bracket that could have been poured in a fraction of the time. You can't whittle an engine block out of a bar. The geometry alone defeats you, the hollow chambers, the branching passages, the interior walls that no chisel can reach from outside. But you can pour one if you have a mold shaped like its hollows. That's casting. That's what the foundry is for. I explained it to them the way my grandfather had explained it to me, standing in the doorway of his restoration shop with a cracked pump housing in one hand and a cup of cold tea in the other. The principle is simple enough to say in a single breath. Make a void in the exact shape of the part you want, then fill the void with molten iron. What comes out, once the iron cools and the mold is broken away, is the part. The difficulty is in everything the simple sentence leaves out. Mokche understood it faster than anyone. He had been a woodworker before he became a toolmaker, and the moment I described the pattern, the wooden replica the iron would copy, something behind his eyes went very still and focused, the way it did when he was measuring a fit by touch. I carve it in wood first, he said, turning a half-finished block over in his hands, and the iron copies the wood exactly. He set the block down on the bench and looked at it for a moment. The part's already real, it's just wooden for now. That was exactly right. The pattern is the part's first life. Everything downstream, the mold, the pour, the casting, is just the process of making that wooden life permanent in iron. Cho-young ran the molding floor. She had come to the foundry the same way she came to everything, by watching until she understood the ratio, then working until her hands knew it without her having to think. Green sand, a mixture of fine river sand, clay, and just enough moisture to hold its shape when squeezed, was her medium now, and she had developed a feel for it that I could not have measured with instruments even if I'd had them. The process was this: pack the green sand around the wooden pattern in a two-part flask, upper and lower, pressing it firm and even in layers, not too hard. Pack it too dense, and the gases the molten iron releases have nowhere to go, and they turn back into voids inside the casting. Not too loose, or the sand collapses when you lift the pattern free. The margin between those two failures was narrow, and Choyoung found it by feel every time. Pack it firm and even, she told the younger workers, pressing her palm flat against the surface of a freshly rammed mold. Too hard, and the gas can't escape. She lifted her hand, studied the faint impression her palm had left. Lift the pattern, and the shape just stays. She demonstrated. The two halves of the flask separated. The wooden pattern came free with a careful twist and lift, and there in the green sand was the negative space, the exact hollow the iron would fill. It looked almost nothing like the part. It looked like a wound in the sand, but it was precise, and precision was what mattered. The cores were Choyoung's particular pride. Where the mold formed the outside of the casting, the cores formed the inside, baked shapes of sand and binder, set into the mold before the flask was closed, suspended in the iron's path so that when the metal flowed around them it left behind a hollow, a pipe, a chamber, a water passage. Get the cores right, and there was almost no shape we couldn't pour, even the water passages of an engine, when we got there. The thought of it was enough to keep me working past the point where the lamplight made my eyes ache. Sorin arrived on the third morning with her measuring rods and her ledger, and she went straight to Moke's bench without greeting anyone. She picked up one of his patterns and held it against the drawing I had made, a bracket for a machine tool base, simple enough to be a good first casting, complex enough to teach us something. She measured the pattern's length, compared it to the drawing's dimension, and set both down. Iron shrinks about 1 part in 100, she said, so Moke carves it that much large, and it cools to true. She opened her ledger and wrote the figure down. We calculate it, then prove it once. That was the shrinkage allowance, one of the invisible corrections built into every pattern, the gap between what the wood looks like and what the iron will become. Iron is not wood. When it cools from the liquid state it contracts, and if the pattern is made to the final dimension, the casting will come out undersize. Moke had already understood this in principle. Sorin gave him the number, and he carved accordingly. The pattern for the bracket was fractionally, precisely oversized in every dimension. It looked wrong to the eye. It would be right in iron. Sorin recorded everything in her ledger, the sand mixture ratios, the core dimensions, the shrinkage factor, the dates. She did not say it was good or that she was satisfied. She wrote it down, which was the same thing. The pour itself was Taho's moment, and he knew it. He had spent 2 days building up to it, checking the ladle, checking the vents cut into the mold's parting line to let the trapped air escape as the iron rose, checking the sprue and the runners that would carry the metal from the pouring cup down into the mold cavity. He checked them again the morning of the pour. Then he checked them once more. When the iron in the crucible reached temperature, a white-orange brightness that made the air above it shimmer and distort, he lifted the ladle with both hands and positioned himself over the mold with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been burned before and intends never to be burned that way again. Steady pour, he said, not to anyone in particular. Fill from the bottom so the air runs out the vents. The iron came out in a smooth, bright stream, and the sand hissed where the heat touched it. Steam rose from the mold in white billows, carrying the smell of hot clay and something deeper, mineral and sharp. The iron rose in the sprue, visible through the vent holes as a climbing brightness. Fill, you beauty, Tahoe said quietly. Fill every corner. We waited. The iron in the vents told us when the cavity was full, when it rose level in the last vent hole. Tahoe stopped the pour and stepped back. The mold sat there, steaming, holding its secret. There was nothing to do but wait for it to cool. The breakout was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Mokje was the one who couldn't stand still. He circled the mold while it cooled, hands clasped behind his back, and when Teho finally judged it ready and nodded, Muk was the first one with a rod in his hand, breaking away the sand with short, careful strokes. Come on, he said under his breath, not caring who heard him. Did it fill? Is it sound? The sand fell away in chunks and the casting emerged, gray-dark, rough with the texture of the sand, trailing loose grains, and wrong. There was a cold shut along one face where two streams of iron had met and failed to fuse, and on the underside a void, a hollow where the metal had not reached. The shape was there mostly, but the part was not sound. Mock set down his rod. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. I picked up the casting and turned it in my hands, reading the failure the way the casting wanted to be read. The cold shut told me the iron had cooled too fast on that face, the runner feeding it was too narrow, or the mold had been too cold, or both. The void on the underside told me the venting there was insufficient. The air had been trapped and the iron had nowhere to push it. Both failures had causes. Both causes had corrections. Not bad luck, I said. Bad gating and venting. The casting just told us how to make the next one right. I set it back down. Listen to it. Mock looked at me, then looked at the casting, and I watched him shift from disappointment to something more useful. He picked it up again and turned it the same way I had, reading it. After a moment he nodded once and carried it to his bench. We widened the runner on the cold shut side. We added 2 vent pins to the underside of the cope. We preheated the mold before the second pour. Soren recorded every change in her ledger. The second pour was quieter than the first. Teho was steadier. The steam rose the same way. The iron climbed the vents the same way. And when Muck broke away the sand the next morning, the casting that emerged was sound. Clean faces, sharp corners, no voids, no cold shuts. He ran his thumb along the edge where the cold shut had been and found only solid iron. Teho stood back and looked at it with his arms crossed and something complicated moving across his face. We made a shape, Smith, he said, that no hammer and no lathe could have cut. He shook his head slowly. Out of sand. A pause. I'll never get used to it. He was right that no hammer could have made it. The bracket had internal ribs, a recessed channel along its base, and a boss on each end with a cord hole through it. Features that would have required hours of machining to produce from bar stock, if they could have been produced at all. We had poured them in one operation. The sand had remembered the shape, and the iron had remembered the sand. The castings that followed over the next days were heavier. Machine tool bases, long and thick, with ribbed undersides for stiffness, housings for spindle bearings, a drum for a new water wheel. Each one came out of the sand a little more confidently than the last, as Mak refined his patterns, and Choyoung refined her molding, and Taeho refined his pour. The loop was becoming visible to me in a way it hadn't been before, not as an idea, but as a physical reality I could walk through. The foundry poured heavy bases. The heavy bases gave the machine tools a steadiness they had never had on their lighter wooden frames, less chatter, truer cuts, closer fits. The truer parts the machine tools now produced fed back into the foundry as better flasks, better core boxes, better pattern-making tools, which meant the next castings were truer, which meant the next machine tools were steadier. Round and round, each turn bigger than the last. I stood in the middle of the foundry floor one evening after the workers had gone and looked at the row of finished castings cooling on the sand, and I thought, this is how it compounds. not by any single breakthrough, but by the loop closing tighter with every revolution. Jiwa Young came at dusk, when the forge fires were banked and the foundry was quiet. She did not come to look at the castings. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and the expression on her face was the one she wore when she was carrying news she had been holding for too long. "They're not coming to tax us now," she said. "They're coming to make an example, so no other dying town gets ideas." The court had declared Iron Ridge a rebel province. The word had come through two separate channels, which meant it was not rumor. They were mustering. How many, she didn't say, but the word she used for the scale of it was not a small word. I looked at the row of castings on the floor, at the ladle hanging on its hook, at the sand still warm from the afternoon's pour. "A foundry that pours iron by the ton," I said, "can pour a great many cannon, Warden. Let them come ready, so will we." She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and left. Teiho found me still in the foundry an hour later, running my hand along the surface of one of the new bases and thinking about what came next. He had been thinking about it too. I could tell from the way he came in, not to do anything but to say something he'd been working up to. "Cast iron's strong, but it shatters," he said. "For the parts that bend and pound and never quit, that's steel, and steel's always beaten me." He said it plainly, without shame, which was how Tejo said most things. Steel had beaten every smith in Iron Ridge. It had beaten smiths in every town I'd passed through. The process was not secret exactly, but it was unreliable, more art than method, more feel than measure, and the results were inconsistent in ways that made the metal untrustworthy for precision work. "Steel is just iron with the carbon tamed to the right amount," I said, "and taming things to the right amount is the one thing this shop does better than anyone alive." He looked at me. "The whole art," I used to say, "lives in a band no wider than a whisper." Cast iron is brittle because it holds too much carbon, 4%, sometimes more, and when you strike it wrong it doesn't bend, it shatters. Wrought iron is soft because it holds almost none, and though you can hammer it all day, it will never take a proper edge or carry a real load. Steel is neither. Steel is the narrow territory between them, somewhere in the range of a fraction of a percent to perhaps 2, and every property that makes it worth building with, the hardness, the spring, the edge that holds, lives in that carbon band. The whole art is hitting it. Not close, not approximately, hitting it. I'd explained this to Tejo and Sorin standing at the edge of the forge floor, the morning still cold enough that our breath showed against the orange light of the banked coals. The words came out plainly, the way I'd learned to say things in Iron Ridge, stripped of the vocabulary of the world I came from, rebuilt from first principles every time. "Steel," I said, "the same metal, with the carbon tuned just right. Too much, it's brittle cast. Too little, it's soft wrought. The whole art is hitting the carbon between." Sorin had her record board under one arm and her measuring cords looped at her belt. She listened the way she always listened, not nodding along, but holding the words still and examining them. "It is a measurement problem," she said, wearing a blacksmith's apron. "We don't guess the carbon, we control it and test until we can prove it." That was the frame she needed. Once she had the frame, she could build the record inside it. I didn't argue with the framing, it was correct. Tahoe was quieter that morning than usual. He'd been quieter since the blast furnace runs, since the night he stood at the tapping channel and watched pig iron pour out in a river of light and said nothing for a long time. Something had shifted in him during those weeks. The man who had arrived at my workshop in the second month of all this, convinced that the gods had cursed his iron, had been replaced by someone who watched processes the way I watched processes, looking for the variable, not the verdict. We began with crucible steel, because crucible steel is controllable. The batches are small, a few caddies at a time, but the conditions are sealed and the inputs can be weighed to the grain. Tejo took to it immediately. He had always had the touch for enclosed heat. It was open air uncertainty that had frustrated him, the variables he couldn't see or name. Here, with a sealed clay crucible packed with measured wrought iron and measured carbon source, set into a coke-fired furnace and held at temperature until the melt was complete, He could feel his way through each stage with the confidence of a man who finally understood what he was feeling for. Sealed tight, measured to the grain, melted till it sings, he said, crouching beside the furnace door with his hand near the vent, reading the heat by the quality of the shimmer. No air, no guessing. This I can feel my way through. The crucible process gave us quality. What it couldn't give us was quantity. For that, we needed the converter. I'd drawn the design over several evenings, a vessel of refractory-lined iron, tilted on a trunnion so it could be poured, with a two-air arrangement at the base to blast air up through the melt. The principle is violent in its simplicity. Charge the converter with molten pig iron from the blast furnace, then drive a blast of air up through it. The oxygen in the air burns the carbon out, burns the silicon and manganese too, burns everything combustible in the melt, and the heat of that combustion is enough to keep the whole mass liquid without any external fuel. You watch the flame at the mouth of the converter as it burns. You read it. When the carbon is nearly gone, the flame changes character, goes from the long, luminous orange of a carbon-rich burn to something shorter and brighter, almost white. Then you stop the blow, and you add back a measured charge of carbon and manganese to hit the grade you want. Burn it all out, then put back the exact pinch that makes steel. It is crude, it is violent. The converter roars when the blast is running, and the flame at its mouth throws light across the whole forge floor. But it will make steel by the ton, and that is what Iron Ridge needs. Not precious small batches of crucible steel for fine instruments, but steel by the ton for crankshafts and axles and springs and the frames of machines not yet built. Taeho ran the first converter blow himself. He'd studied the drawings, asked his questions, and then set them aside, and stood at the converter with his arms folded, watching the flame. I stood back. There are moments when the right thing is to let a man work. The blow ran for several minutes. The flame at the mouth went through its stages, the early orange, the long luminous burn of the silicon going out, then the transition as the carbon load dropped. Tahoe watched it without moving. His face in the converter's light was the face of a man reading a text he'd spent 40 years learning to read without knowing that's what he was doing. The spark went bushy to bright. Carbon nearly gone, he said, not loudly, more to himself than to us. A breath more. He held still another moment, and then, now stop the blow. The blast cut off. The roar died. The flame at the converter's mouth shrank and steadied. 40 years of fire taught me to read that. Sorin was already moving. She had her test rods ready, small samples drawn from the melt before the blow stopped, quenched in water, laid out on her bench in order. She worked through them methodically, hardness tests with a standard file and a set of reference pieces she'd made herself over the preceding weeks. Bend tests, where a rod is clamped and loaded until it either springs back or breaks, and the angle at which it breaks tells you something about the carbon and the grain. She recorded everything, every batch, every result, every variable she could name, the charge weight, the blast duration, the temperature of the pig iron at the charge, the carbon addition at the end, the quench method. Now spring steel isn't a feeling in his hands, she said, writing without looking up. It's a page anyone can follow. His genius made into instructions. The early batches were not all right. This was expected. The first converter run came out too hard. The carbon addition at the end had been slightly heavy, or the blow had stopped the breath too soon, or both. We didn't curse the batch. We read it. Seirin's records told us where the process had drifted. Taeho adjusted the next run. The second batch was too soft. The blow had run a moment long, burned past the target, and the carbon addition hadn't fully compensated. We read that too. Third run, we were closer. Fourth run, we were inside the range Seirin had defined for structural steel, the range where the hardness file cut with a certain resistance, where the bend test showed deflection without fracture, where the broken end of a test piece showed a fine, consistent grain rather than the coarse crystalline face of cast iron or the fibrous shred of rock. The fifth run produced the first true steel. Taeho pulled the test piece from the quench bucket himself. It was a flat bar, perhaps 2 fingers wide and a hand's length long. drawn from the converter's last pour and quenched in water. He held it in both hands and bent it, not to breaking, just to feel the resistance, and it flexed and came back. He struck it against the edge of the anvil, and it rang, not the dull thud of wrought iron, not the sharp crack of cast. It rang, a clear, sustained note that hung in the forge air for a moment before fading. He stood there holding it, and I watched his face. It bends and comes back, he said. His voice was different, not the forge master's controlled authority, something younger than that. And rings, he struck it again, listening. My whole life hard meant brittle, and here it is both, in my hand. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to add to that. What steel unlocks is not a small thing. I'd been working toward this point since the first weeks in Iron Ridge, since the charcoal-fired bloomery and the first rough iron bar, since the water wheel and the trip hammer and the blast furnace and the long months of building the tools to build the tools. Steel is the engine's heart, the crankshaft that converts reciprocating motion to rotation, the connecting rods, the valves, the springs that keep the valve seated. Steel is the vehicle's bones, the axles that carry load, the leaf springs that absorb road shock, the gears that transmit power without stripping under torque. And steel is, when the empire eventually comes with its army and its intention to take what Iron Ridge has built, the cannon that hold pressure without bursting, the barrels that don't fail at the breech. I said it plainly because it needed to be said plainly. The engine's heart, the vehicle's bones, and yes, when the empire comes, cannon that hold. Sorin was still writing. She didn't look up, but she heard it. The real triumph of those days wasn't the steel itself, it was the repeatability. A smith who makes good steel once has done something impressive. A forge that makes steel to grade, batch after batch, with records that tell you why each batch landed where it landed and what to adjust if it drifts, that is something else entirely. That is the difference between a man's knowledge and a processor's knowledge, between a craft and an industry. Sorin said it better than I could have. A smith used to be the recipe, she said, setting down her brush and looking at the row of test records on her bench, and it died with him. Now the recipe outlives anyone. That's the difference between a craft and an industry. Teho was still holding the test bar. He'd set it down once and then picked it up again, the way you handle something you're not quite ready to put away. I watched him turn it in his hands, and I thought I understood what he was working through. He'd come to me in the early days as a man who believed his iron was cursed. Not metaphorically, he'd meant it. The mandate had withdrawn from his forge, he said. The gods had turned their faces away. The iron that had obeyed his father and his grandfather would not obey him. He'd been right that something had changed. He'd been wrong about why. The mandate, that inherited guttering magic that had smoothed so many rough edges in this world for so long, had been failing everywhere, not just in his forge. The iron wasn't cursed. The iron was just iron, and the old ways of working it had depended on something that was no longer there to depend on. What he'd learned since then, the chemistry of the blast furnace, the carbon arithmetic of steel making, the way a converter flame reads the burn, none of it was magic. It had never been magic. It had been waiting, patient and indifferent, for anyone willing to learn to see it. He didn't say this aloud, but I could see him thinking it, the way you can sometimes see a man arrive at the end of a long calculation. His face in the forge light was quiet and certain. The mandate was never in it. This was always here, for anyone who'd learned to see it. We ran 2 more batches before the light failed that evening, logging both against Sorin's records. The converter had found its rhythm. Teho had found his. The steel coming out of those last runs was consistent. Structural grade, spring grade, the beginnings of what would eventually be tool steel once we had better control of the alloy additions. Each batch was a page in a book that would outlast all of us. I stood at the edge of the forge floor as the fires were banked for the night, looking at the row of test bars on Sorin's bench and the pages of records beside them. The veil outside was doing what it always did at dusk, the pale dome over Iron Ridge dimming slightly, the way it dimmed a little more each month, the slow retreat of something that had once seemed permanent. Inside the forge the coals still glowed. We had steel to grade, the carbon band, hit and held and recorded. Tomorrow was casting, the shapes too complex to carve from bar stock, the housings and brackets and bearing seats that had to be poured rather than cut. And after casting, forging, the parts too important to cast, the crankshafts and axles and connecting rods that needed the grain refinement only hammer work could give. The cathedral of fire, as I'd come to think of it, every process feeding the next, every capability unlocking the one above it. We cast the shapes too complex to carve, I said to no one in particular, and forged the parts too important to cast. Cathedral of fire tomorrow, and the hammer after. Teho set the last test bar down on the bench beside the others. Sorin capped her ink and rolled her records. The forge settled into its evening sounds, the tick of cooling iron, the low breath of the banked coals, the distant creak of the water wheel still turning in the dark outside. Steel, the narrow band between too much and too little. The furnace had been burning for 3 days without rest. I had stopped thinking of the foundry as a building somewhere around the second night. A building has walls, you notice, a roof that keeps rain off, corners where the cold pools in winter. What we had built at the base of Iron Ridge's eastern slope was something else, a throat of fire sunk into the hillside, fed by bellows the size of ox carts, ringed by charging platforms and ladle cranes, and the ranked mouths of drying ovens where the big molds sweated out their last moisture before they were committed to the pour. You didn't enter it so much as submit to it, the heat pressed against your chest like a hand. The light it threw had no color a lamp could match, orange at the core, white where the steel ran, and a red that lived in the smoke above the crucible deck that I had no name for. We do this huge, and we do it perfectly, or we don't do it at all. That was the rule I had laid down when we broke ground on the expansion. Not a boast, a constraint. The parts we needed now, machine frames, gear housings, the great bed castings that would anchor the planer and the boring mill, were too large and too complex to be built any other way. You could not hammer a machine frame into shape, you could not whittle it from timber and hope it held. The only path was to pour it, one piece, in a mold big enough to swallow a man, and get it right on the first attempt, because the second attempt cost another week of pattern work and another charge of steel you didn't have to waste. Mokje had understood that before I finished explaining it. He had been in the pattern shop for 6 weeks by the time the big molds were ready, and the work he produced in that time was unlike anything I had seen a man build by hand. The patterns themselves were man-sized, some of them taller than Mok, braced on internal frames of seasoned pine, shaped by adze and spokus have and scraper until the surfaces ran true enough to release cleanly from the packed sand. But the cores were the real labor. A single large casting might require a dozen of them, hollow inserts of baked sand and linseed oil that would sit inside the mold and create the internal passages, the bolt-boss recesses, the lightning pockets that kept the casting from being a solid block of metal too heavy to move. Each core had to be positioned, supported, vented. Each had to survive the pour without cracking, without shifting, without floating up in the rising steel and ruining the geometry. A finger slip here is a ton of ruined steel, Muck had said one evening, turning a core box in his hands and sighting down its parting face. The big ones are terrifying. I love them. He said it the way a man says he loves a difficult river, not despite the danger, but because the danger was honest about what it was. Moke had spent years making small things with great precision. The large patterns asked for something different, a feel for how a shape would behave at scale, how the metal would flow and shrink and pull against itself as it cooled, where the last material to solidify would be, and whether you had given it somewhere to feed from. He had made mistakes in the early trials. He had remade the patterns without complaint. By the time we were ready for the production molds, the cores fit their boxes with a tightness that left no gap for the steel to penetrate and sinter them into place. The choreography of the pour itself belonged to Doguang. I had known since the first small heats that Do thought about the foundry floor the way a general thinks about ground, every position mapped, every line of movement considered, every contingency assigned a response before it happened rather than after. For the big pour, he had spent 2 days walking the floor with his crew, placing each man and woman at their station, walking the routes they would travel and the routes they would not, marking in chalk where the ladle would swing and where no foot should ever be when it did. He had run the crew through the sequence dry, no metal, no heat, just the motion, until they could execute it without spoken command. Molten steel doesn't forgive a wandering foot, he told them on the morning of the first big heat, his voice carrying over the furnace noise without effort. We move as one, or we don't move. Positions! And they moved to their positions, and they held them, and the tap was open. The first time I watched a large heat run into a man-sized mold, I understood why people in other ages had built temples. The metal came out of the furnace not as a stream, but as a presence, a roaring, luminous mass that filled the ladle and set the air above it dancing with a heat shimmer that bent the far wall of the foundry into something unreal. When the ladle tilted and the steel began to fall into the sprue, the light it threw was absolute. Every shadow in the building vanished. The sparks that rode up on the thermal were not sparks in the way a forge fire makes sparks. They were fragments of star, gone before you could track them. The noise was not loud so much as total, a sound that occupied the chest cavity and left no room for thought. Ekteho stood at the pour station with his eyes on the riser, watching the level climb. Keep it full, he called over the roar. No breaks in the stream. Let her rise even. Fill her. The crew kept it full. The stream held. The riser climbed at the rate Mach's calculations had predicted, and when it reached the mark scratched into the cope, Doe's hand came up and the ladle tilted back, and the pour was done. We stood in the cooling light and said nothing for a while. The shakeout 2 days later was its own kind of ceremony. The sand came away in packed slabs, still warm at the core, and what it revealed, knocked clean, wire brushed, the gates and risers cut away, was a machine frame in one piece, not assembled, not riveted from plate and angle iron, with 100 joints that each represented a potential crack, a potential slip, a potential failure under load. One piece poured whole, the internal geometry held by cores that had done their job and crumbled out clean. Mokje walked around it 3 times before he said anything. One piece, he said finally, no joints, no welds, no weak seams. Choyoung, who had come down from the pattern shop to see the breakout, stood with her arms crossed and looked at the frame for a long moment. Che, she said quietly, we just poured a thing bigger than us. She meant it more than one way. I heard both meanings and did not correct either of them. The metallurgy had come a long way since the early heats of the season. Bakteho had spent the better part of a year working through the composition problems, the carbon control, the manganese additions, the deoxidation practice that separated cast iron from cast steel, and the difference in what we could now pour was not incremental. Cast iron is hard and brittle and good for many things. It will not take the shock loads that a machine frame must absorb without cracking. Cast steel is tougher, more forgiving of stress concentrations, capable of being machined to a finish that iron will not hold. Getting the carbon content right, getting the temperature right at tap, getting the steel into the mold before it lost the heat it needed to fill every corner of the cavity. All of that had required failures, and analysis of failures, and adjustments, and more failures before Beck had the process in hand. He stood beside the cleaned frame and ran his palm along the machining boss where the spindle bearing would eventually seat. A year ago I couldn't make a spear that held, he said. Now I pour shapes in steel no smith in the empire could dream of. He said it without pride, or rather with a pride so thoroughly converted into fact that it no longer needed the tone. He was right. What we were producing was not a refinement of what the empire's foundries made. It was a different category of object. The yard outside the foundry had begun to look like the skeleton of a future. Rough castings stood in rows on timber bearers, each tagged with chalk marks indicating which machine shop operation came next. Rough bore here, face there, scraped to fit at final assembly. Gear blanks, still carrying their draft taper and the witness marks of the parting line. Housings for the mill spindles, the wall thickness calculated to carry the cutting loads without deflection. The great bed casting for the planer, longer than 4 men laid end to end, its ways still rough from the mold, but true in section to within what the scraper would be able to correct. Cast rough and heavy here, machined precise there, the foundry and the shop feeding each other. That was the loop I had been trying to close since the first days at Iron Ridge. The foundry could produce shapes of arbitrary complexity in a single pour, but the surfaces it left were too rough and too variable for any precision application. The machine shop could produce surfaces of extraordinary accuracy, but only if it had something to start from, a casting or a forging that was already close to the final form, so that the cutting tools were removing a controlled amount of material rather than fighting their way through a raw billet. Each capability made the other more powerful. The foundry gave the machine shop near-net shapes to work from. The machine shop gave the foundry the precise tooling, the boring bars, the facing plates, the jig fixtures that allowed the patterns to be made more accurately in the first place. The near miss happened on the 4th day of the second production run. A mold that had not fully dried, the outer surface had red dried to the probe, but moisture had persisted in a thick section of the cope, released a steam kick when the steel hit it. The pressure was not large by the standards of what the furnace itself contained, but it was sudden, and it threw a spray of metal and sand across the pour station in a direction no one had been standing. It hit empty ground because we don't gamble with where people stand, Do said, when the crew had stepped back and the floor had been assessed. Reset, dry the molds, again, carefully. No one argued. No one needed to be told twice. The mold was broken out, the cavity inspected, the drying cycle extended by a full day. The pour that followed was clean. Ji Wol-young came down from the warden's hall on the 5th day and stood at the edge of the cannon row without speaking for a long time. The cannon had not been my preference. I had come to Iron Ridge to build machines, not weapons, and there was a version of this work in which the foundry produced only frames and housings and the peaceful architecture of production. But the Empire had been mustering for months. The intelligence that came through Wol-young's network was consistent on that point, and a town that could not defend itself would not be a town much longer. The same furnace that poured machine frames poured cannon, the same steel, the same crew, the same process applied to a different pattern. When the Empire comes for its rebel province, Wol-young said at last, it will not find the town it expects. I looked at the row of finished barrels, still in their cooling frames, the bores rough cast and waiting for the boring bar. The same fire that builds the future arms it, I said. I'd rather only build, but I'll do both, if it keeps these people free. Wol-young nodded once and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The foundry burned through the night and burned through the day, and the crew that tended it had found a rhythm that was no longer effortful. It was simply the way time passed at Iron Ridge now, measured in heats and pours and breakouts rather than in the sun's position. They ate their meals in the furnace glow, seated on the timber bearers that held the cooling castings, the light orange on their faces, the smell of hot metal and burned sand so constant it had ceased to be a smell and become simply the air. Mokje said one evening that the court had called them rubbish. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you state a measurement that turned out to be wrong. Chayoung looked at the frame they had poured that morning, still on its bearer, waiting for the machine shop. The court can't see what a thing's worth, she said. That's their whole problem. We can. That's ours. No one added to that. The furnace breathed, and the castings cooled, and the yard filled with the skeleton of what was coming. But there was a limit to what the mold could do, and I had known it from the beginning. A cast part can look perfect and be secretly weak. The grain is random. The solidification front moves through the section in ways you cannot fully control. And where the last metal freezes, there is always the possibility of porosity, of shrinkage, of a flaw that no surface inspection will reveal. For most of the parts we were making, that was acceptable. A machine frame carries its loads in compression and bending, and the safety factors we designed in were large enough to accommodate the variability of the cast structure. But a crankshaft is not a machine frame. A crankshaft carries torsion and bending simultaneously at high cycle rates, with stress concentrations at every fillet and journal. The grain of the steel matters enormously, not random as casting leaves it, but aligned, worked, refined by deformation until the material in the finished part is stronger in the directions that need strength. For that, the mold was not the answer. For that, we go to the hammer. I had been thinking about the power hammer for months. The water from the upper mill race had enough head to drive it, a helve hammer or a trip hammer of sufficient weight, the cam profile designed to give a controlled blow rate, the anvil mass calculated to keep the energy in the workpiece rather than in the foundation. Under a hammer of the right scale, a steel billet could be worked from cast ingot to refined forging in a series of heats, the grain structure broken up and reoriented with each blow, the material becoming something the furnace alone could never produce. We build a hammer the water swings, I said to no one in particular, standing at the edge of the casting yard in the last light, one that hits like a falling mountain, and under it, steel remembers how to be strong. The foundry burned behind me, the castings waited in their rows. In the machine shop, the scrapers and boring bars were already at work on the first of the rough frames, cutting them toward the tolerances that would make them useful. The loop was closing, heat by heat, cut by cut, and what was taking shape in the yard and the shop and the furnace was not yet what I needed it to be, but it was becoming it, in the way that iron becomes steel, under pressure, under heat, by process, and not by accident. The power hammer was next. The crankshaft was after that. The strongest parts cannot be cast. I had known this since I was old enough to stand beside my grandfather's bench and watch him sort failures. A cracked gear tooth here, a sheared bolt there. The fracture surface always the same dull gray of randomly frozen crystal. Cast iron, cast bronze, cast steel. The grain inside goes wherever it pleases when the metal solidifies. A crowd of crystalline needles pointing in every direction at once, loyal to nothing. Strike it hard enough in the wrong direction, and it simply quits. The grain doesn't care about your design. It never did. Forging is the answer to that indifference. I had explained it to them the way my grandfather explained it to me, standing in the half-finished forge hall, with the smell of charcoal and quench water hanging in the air. Forging lines the grain up with the shape, I told them. Cast it, the grain's random and weak. Forge it, and it gets stronger exactly where it's worked hardest. Baktaho had nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed what his hands had already suspected for 40 years. Mokche had said nothing, but I watched his eyes move to the half-finished die blocks stacked against the wall, already calculating. I reached for a piece of pine branch, the kind that grows curved around a bend in the trunk, following the light. Then I picked up a flat plank sawn from straight-grained timber and bent it across my knee until it cracked. I held both pieces up. Strength isn't just the metal, I said, it's how the metal flows. The branch curve, grown into its shape over years of reaching, would have held. The sawn curve, its grain sliced across at every critical point, failed the moment you asked anything of it. Metal is the same. A crankshaft forged from a billet, hammered and hammered again until the grain bends with the throw, follows the fillet, wraps around every stress riser, is a different object than a crankshaft poured into a mold. Same composition, different creature entirely. The power hammer had taken most of 3 weeks to finish after the water wheel was running reliably. Mokche had driven the work with the focused quiet of a man who has finally been handed the tool he has been missing his whole life and does not intend to waste a single hour of it. The mechanism was straightforward in principle, a heavy iron head mounted on a guided ram, lifted by a rotating cam driven off the main water wheel shaft, released at the top of its travel to fall under its own weight, but straightforward in principle and straightforward in practice are two different countries, and Mokche had crossed the border between them with characteristic stubbornness and very little sleep. The cam profile had to be right, too steep a rise, and the head would chatter off the cam face rather than lifting cleanly. Too gradual, and the drop height was wasted, the blow soft. The guides had to be true. A ram that wandered even a fraction of a sun width would batter the dies crooked and ruin every part it touched. The anvil block beneath had to be massive enough that its inertia absorbed the blow rather than bouncing it back up through the workpiece. Mok had solved each problem in sequence, quietly, without fanfare, and when he finally stepped back from the finished machine and looked at it, he said only what he always said when something worked. The wheel lifts the head, the cam lets it drop, all day. He paused, looking at the iron head hanging at the top of its travel, patient and enormous. I would not want to be the steel under it. He wasn't wrong. When we first ran it under load, a scrap billet of medium carbon steel, heated to a full forging orange in the rebuilt furnace, the sound was something that went past hearing and became something you felt in your back teeth. The scale flew off the billet in a spray of orange sparks with every blow, each impact driving the surface clean, and the billet stretched and flattened and moved the way metal is supposed to move when it is properly hot and properly struck, decisively, without argument. Baektaeho stood at the working position with a pair of long-handled tongs, turning the billet between blows with a practiced economy of motion that made it clear he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. His face in the forge light was something I did not look at directly. Some things are private. Feel that. Every blow's driving the grain. He had to shout over the hammer, but the shout was not a shout of alarm. 40 years I dreamed of a hammer like this. He worked the billet through a full drawing pass, rotating it a quarter turn between every blow, keeping the reduction even, watching the shape with eyes that had been calibrated by 4 decades of hand hammer work. The power hammer did not replace that knowledge. It could not. It simply removed the ceiling that tired arms had always imposed on it. He understood this perfectly. When we paused to reheat the billet, he set the tongs down on the anvil face and flexed his right hand, the one that had been swollen at the knuckle joints for as long as I had known him, and looked at the machine with an expression I can only describe as professional respect between equals. The hammer's the muscle, he said. The knowing where and when to hit, that's still mine. That'll always be mine. He was right about that too. A power hammer in the hands of someone who does not know metal is just a very expensive way to ruin billets. The machine amplifies judgment. It cannot replace it. Tejo's judgment, where the heat was right, when to turn, how much reduction per pass, where the grain needed to be driven and where it needed to be left alone, that was the irreplaceable part. The hammer simply meant he could apply that judgment 1,000 times a day instead of 100, and wake up the next morning able to do it again. The real power came when Mokje's dies entered the equation. He had been cutting them for 2 weeks in parallel with the hammer construction, working from the part drawings we had made together, closed dies, upper and lower, the cavity between them the precise negative of the finished forging. The principle of closed die forging is simple enough. Heat the billet to forging temperature, place it between the dies, strike it until the metal fills the cavity completely, trim the flash that squeezes out around the parting line. What you get is a part that is strong because it was forged, and repeatable because the die controls the shape. Mach had cut the first set of dies for a connecting rod blank, a shape I had chosen because it was demanding enough to prove the method and useful enough to justify the effort. The rod needed a thick section at the big end where it wrapped the crank pin, a thinner section through the shank where it only needed to resist buckling, and a small end boss for the wrist pin. All of it needed to be forged with the grain running lengthwise through the shank and wrapping around both bosses, not cut across. The first closed die run produced a part that made Mokje set it down on the bench and look at it for a long moment without speaking. "My dies, Beck's hammer," he said finally. "The part's strong and repeatable." It was. I checked it against the drawing. The dimensions were within what our current measurement tools could verify. The flash line was clean. The surface showed the tight worked grain of properly forged steel, rather than the open cast surface we had been living with. We could make another one tomorrow that would match it, and the one after that. I held the connecting rod blank in both hands and let myself think, for just a moment, about what it meant. We can make the heart of an engine now. We're actually going to get there. I set it back down before anyone could see my face do whatever it was doing. Yun Sorin had been present for most of the hammer trials, her record book open, her brush moving. She was not the kind of person who accepted a claim without evidence, and she had made clear from the beginning that forged parts are stronger was a claim that required the same treatment as any other, a test, a measurement, a result that could be written down and repeated. She had prepared the test herself, without being asked. 2 bars of the same medium carbon steel, same dimensions, same length, one cast in a sand mold, one forged from a billet under the power hammer. She had set them up in the test frame Moke had built for the purpose, a simple 4-post frame with a loading screw and a beam to measure deflection, and she had loaded them to failure in front of all of us. The cast bar broke. It broke cleanly and suddenly, the way cast metal breaks, with a sharp crack and a fracture surface that was gray and granular and told the whole story of its random, undirected grain. The forged bar bent. It bent visibly, measurably, and then held, and then bent further when she added more load, and held again, the metal working and deforming and refusing to quit in the way that properly forged, properly grained steel refuses to quit when you ask it to carry a load it was shaped to carry. She looked at the 2 specimens for a moment, then at the rest of us. "We don't forge the critical parts because a book says so," she said. "We forge them because I broke the other kind and watched." She wrote the results in her record book with the same careful brushstrokes she used for everything else and said nothing more about it. She didn't need to. After that, the work moved quickly. The hammer ran in 2 shifts, Teiho taking the first and training 2 of the senior apprentices for the second under his direct supervision. The dies multiplied, crankshaft throws, connecting rod blanks, axle shafts, steering knuckles, the heavy flanged hubs that would eventually carry wheels. Each one came out of the dies strong and near net shape, needing only the finishing work that our machine tools could provide, the boring, the turning, the grinding that would bring them to the precise dimensions that spinning parts require. The forge hall in those weeks had a quality I have not forgotten. The hammer ran almost continuously, its rhythm a deep, even thunder that you stopped noticing after the first hour and only noticed again when it stopped. The furnace glowed orange through the charging door. Scale accumulated on the floor around the anvil in drifts of blue-black flakes that crunched underfoot. The air smelled of hot iron and coal smoke and the particular sharp smell of steel that has been worked hard. Crankshafts, connecting rods, axle shafts, steering knuckles, the bones of an engine and a drivetrain, forged one by one, stacked on the part shelf in the corner of the hall. The hard part isn't can we make it anymore, it's making it precise enough to spin. That was the truth I was living with. We had crossed the threshold from impossible to achievable, the fire side of the problem, the materials side, the shaping side. What remained was the precision side, the gears and bearings and ground surfaces that would take these forged bones and give them the ability to run true at speed, hour after hour, without destroying themselves. That was the next mountain. But first we had to stand on top of this one for a moment and look at what we had built. It was Big Taeho who said it, one evening when the hammer had been shut down for the night and the 4 of us, Taeho, Mokje Sorin, Choyoung, were sitting in the cooling forge hall with the parts shelf visible in the lamplight, stacked with forged blanks that had not existed 6 months ago. "When did we become the people who know things, Smith?" I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. "The day you each decided you could," I said. I only pointed. You walked it. Tahoe looked at the parts shelf for a while longer, then nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. It was Chi Wolyung who broke the mood, arriving at the forge hall door with the look she wore when the news was bad and she had decided not to soften it. She came inside and stood in the lamplight, and the quality of her stillness told me everything before she spoke. "The whole empire's weight, marching to make sure no other dying town dreams what we've built." She looked at each of us in turn. "We have the summer, maybe." The forge hall was very quiet. The anvil block ticked as it cooled. I looked at the parts shelf, the crankshaft throws, the connecting rod blanks, the axle shafts, and thought about what a power hammer could forge besides engine parts. The same dies that shaped a crankshaft throw could shape a cannon breech. The same process that gave us axle shafts could give us armor plate. Forging is forging. The grain flows where you direct it, and it does not care what the finished part is used for. The hammer that forges crankshafts forges cannon and armor too, I said. A free people that can't defend itself just gets a slower kind of dying. No one argued with that. Taeho was quiet for a moment, looking at the hammer in the shadows at the far end of the hall, the great iron head resting at the bottom of its travel, patient, waiting for morning. What could we possibly still not make? He asked. It was a genuine question, not a boast. He had watched the impossible become routine often enough that the boundaries of possible had genuinely shifted for him. I understood the feeling. I also understood what was still on the other side of those boundaries. The parts that have to be perfect, I said. Gears, bearings, the things that spin true forever. Fire got us the bones. Precision gives them life. I looked at Wol Young. Right after we survive an empire. Outside, the veil over Iron Ridge held its pale light against the dark, thinner than it had been a year ago, thinner than it had been a season ago. The summer, she had said, maybe. We had forged the bones, the ore had come out of the ground, been smelted to iron, refined to steel, cast where casting served, and forged where forging was the only answer. The chain was complete from the mountain to the parts shell. What came next required a different kind of fire, not the forge fire, but the slower, more exacting fire of precision work, of surfaces ground flat to within a hair's width, of gears cut tooth by tooth to profiles that would mesh without error at speed. And before that, an empire that had decided our survival was a problem it needed to solve. The hammer waited in the dark. The parts shelf held its full. The same steel goes in dull and soft, comes out glass hard or spring tough or hard skinned. I have explained this to apprentices a dozen times now, and every time I watch their faces do the same thing. A slow crease of disbelief followed by something that wants to be awe. I understand the impulse. It looks like sorcery. It is just the most careful cooking in the world. The heat treatment shed stood apart from the main forge by 30 paces, which was Baektaeho's requirement and not mine. He had his reasons. The air inside the main forge was already thick with variables, charcoal smoke, the breath of bellows, the scatter of scale, and Taeho wanted none of that contaminating what he called his readings. His shed was smaller, cleaner, and hotter in a different way, a focused, deliberate heat rather than the broad roar of the smelting furnace. When I stepped through the low doorway that morning, the warmth pressed against my face like a held palm. Taeho was at his bench with his back to me, turning a gear blank in his hands. It was a soft gray thing, freshly machined, still carrying the faint silver sheen of the cutting tool's last pass. Unremarkable. It could have been a river stone worn into shape by accident. He set it down without looking up. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. Every time I hold one of these before it goes in, I waited. I keep thinking about how much work is already in it. The ore, the smelting, the forging, the machining, all of that, and it's still not done. He turned to face me. One wrong step here and it's scrapped. He was not wrong. Heat treatment is the last secret, and it is also the step most likely to be skipped by someone who doesn't understand what it does. A machine part looks finished. It has its shape, its dimensions, its fit. What it does not yet have is its character, the internal arrangement of its grain that determines whether it will hold under load or shatter, whether it will wear slowly over years or chew itself to dust in a season. That character is written in fire and time and the speed of cooling, and it cannot be seen from the outside until something breaks. Taeho lifted the blank and held it toward the furnace mouth, where the coals burned at the color he wanted, a particular orange-white that he had learned to read the way a river pilot reads the surface of moving water. He had been doing this for 2 years now, since the early days when I had handed him a cold chisel and a bucket of oil and explained the principle in terms so basic I was half embarrassed to say them aloud. He had not needed the embarrassment. He had needed the principle, and once he had it, he built the rest himself. The blank went into the furnace. We waited. Taeho watched the color. I watched Taeho. When he pulled it out, it was glowing, a deep, even cherry orange across its whole body, the color uniform enough that I felt a small, involuntary satisfaction at the sight of it. He held it for exactly the count he had established through weeks of testing, then plunged it into the oil bath. The oil erupted in a brief, violent hiss, smoke curling upward in a tight column, and when he lifted the part clear and wiped it down, it had changed, not in shape, in nature. Hard now, he said, tapping it lightly with his knuckle. The sound was different, sharper, higher, with an edge to it that the soft blank had not possessed, and brittle enough to break if I look at it wrong. He set it on the bench and regarded it with an expression I had come to recognize as professional dissatisfaction. Half a transformation is no good to anyone. This is the trap that catches people who learn the first half of heat treatment and stop. Quench hardening takes a steel part from soft to glass hard in the time it takes oil to stop smoking. The hardness is real, so is the brittleness. The rapid quench that locks the carbon into its hard martensite structure also locks in stress, internal tension distributed through the grain like a held breath. Drop the part wrong, load it wrong, and it doesn't bend, it shatters. A gear that shatters in an engine is not a failed gear, it is a grenade. Teho moved to the second furnace, smaller, cooler, its coals banged to a lower temperature, and placed the hardened blank inside. This was the tempering step, and it was here that his particular gift showed most clearly. Tempering requires heat, but far less than the initial hardening. The goal is to relieve the locked-in stress, to give the steel's structure enough energy to relax slightly without losing the hardness gained in the quench. The measure of that relaxation is written on the surface of the steel itself, in a sequence of colors that run across the polished face as the temperature climbs: straw, then bronze, then a spreading blue. He watched the colors the way I had once watched him watch them on a chisel. That had been the first week, the very first week, when I was still trying to understand what I had and what I was missing, when the whole enterprise felt like trying to build a ship from the description of a ship. I had needed to demonstrate something fast and legible, something that would make the principle visible, and the chisel was the right size for that. Teho had watched the colors run across the steel's face and gone very still, and I had known then that he understood not just the fact, but the reason. He understood it better now. "The same trick you taught me on a chisel the first week," he said, not looking away from the furnace. "Only now I'm reading it on a gear that'll spin in an engine." He pulled the part at the right color, the bronze edge just beginning to shade toward blue at the thinnest sections, and set it to cool in still air. The brittleness was gone. The hardness had given back a fraction of itself in exchange for toughness, which is the trade you make and the trade you want. A tough, hard part bends before it breaks, and bending gives warning, shattering gives none. But a gear has a particular problem that neither quench hardening nor tempering alone can solve. A gear needs its teeth to be hard, hard enough to resist the constant grinding contact of mesh, the sliding and rolling pressure of load, and it needs its core to be tough, resilient enough to absorb shock without cracking through. These are opposing requirements, and no single composition of steel satisfies both simultaneously. The hard steel that resists wear is too brittle at its core. The tough steel that absorbs shock is too soft at its surface. There is no single steel that is both, so we make one steel be both, in the right places. Case hardening is older than I am, older than the kingdom, older than most of what passes for metallurgical knowledge in this part of the world. The principle is simple. Pack the steel part in a carbon-rich medium, charcoal, bone meal, the right organic material, seal it and hold it at temperature for long enough that carbon migrates into the surface layer of the steel, enriching it, changing its composition in the outermost skin while the core remains unchanged. Then quench. The surface, now carbon-rich, hardens. The core, still low carbon, stays tough. One part, two natures, hard skin, soft heart. Tahoe had a batch of gear blanks packed in their clay-sealed boxes, sitting in the case-hardening furnace. He had been running this step since before dawn. When he cracked the first box open and lifted the part clear of the spent charcoal, it was dark with carbon residue, unremarkable to look at. He cleaned it, quenched it, tempered it, and then held it up. He struck it with a small hammer, not hard, just a tap, the kind of tap you use to listen rather than to test. Tink! The sound was clean and high and definite. He nodded once. That's a part that'll live, he said. A dull thud is a part that'll fail. The metal tells you, if you've learned its language. Across the shed, Yun So-rin was at her table, writing. She had been there since the first quench, recording temperatures against time against the color observations Taho called out to her, cross-referencing against the hardness tests she ran on witness coupons pulled from each batch, small rectangular bars of the same steel, processed alongside the actual parts, sacrificed to the file and the scratch gauge so the real parts didn't have to be. She had a system now, temperature range, soak time, quench medium, temper temperature, temper duration, final hardness, each variable recorded, each result logged, the recipe accumulating. A recipe 100 apprentices can follow, she said, without looking up from her writing, outlives the best ear in the world. Taeho made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. He respected Sorin's records. He also trusted his ear in a way that numbers on a page could not fully capture, and both of them knew it, and both of them were right. The ear was faster. The record was permanent. The right answer was to have both, which was what they had built. Cho-young had been standing near the doorway for the better part of an hour, watching. She was one of the orphan masters, one of the young people who had come up through the workshop, who had learned by doing before they had learned by being taught, whose hands knew processes that their mouths sometimes struggled to explain. She had a feel for proportion, for ratio, for the way things fit together by touch and eye. Heat treatment was not her domain, but she had asked to watch, and Taeho had let her stay. When he handed her the finished gear, the case hardened, tempered gear, cleaned and cooled, she turned it in her hands the way he had turned the blank that morning. Then she tapped it herself, mimicking the motion she had watched him perform. Tink! Her face opened. It rings now. She looked up, and her expression was the one I had seen on the apprentices, the disbelief cracking into something larger. Hard skin, soft heart, just like you said. How is this not magic? No one answered immediately. The furnace breathed. Taeho was already preparing the next batch. It was Se-rin who spoke, setting down her brush. The temple claimed only a blessed bloodline could do it. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not bitterness exactly, more like the satisfaction of a long account finally settled. She had grown up near the temple, near the ceremonies, near the careful management of who was permitted to know what and why. It was here all along, in a furnace, for anyone. I thought about that. I had thought about it before, in other forms, watching other processes click into place. The three-plate method, the lead screw, the governor. Every time we made something repeatable, something teachable, something that did not require a particular bloodline or a particular blessing or a particular gift that could not be named or transferred, we were making the same argument, the argument that the wonder was never in the blood. It was in the method. They said wonder belongs to the few, I said. We keep proving it belongs to whoever shows up to learn. Cho was still holding the gear, still feeling its weight. She would carry that feeling with her, I thought. The ring of a part that would live. Heat treatment is invisible in the finished machine. You cannot see it. You cannot point to it. A gear that has been properly case hardened and tempered looks, to the untrained eye, exactly like a gear that has not. The difference lives inside the metal, in the arrangement of its grain, in the depth of its hardened case, in the residual stress pattern that determines how it will behave under load over time. It is the difference between a machine that runs a week and one that runs 30 years. This is why it gets skipped. This is why it was skipped here before I arrived. Not out of laziness, but out of ignorance, which is a different problem and a harder one. You cannot fix laziness with knowledge. You can fix ignorance with knowledge, but only if someone is willing to be the one who knows and the one who teaches, and only if the teaching produces records that outlast the teacher. Taeho was finishing the last batch of the day. He had been at it since before first light, and his face showed it, the particular exhaustion of sustained precision, which is different from the exhaustion of sustained labor. He moved more slowly now, but he moved with the same care. He would not rush the last batch to reach the end of the day. I had never seen him rush a batch. He pulled the final part from the tempering furnace, tapped it, listened. Tink! I'll not send a soul out with a part one haven't heard sing, he said. He set it on the cooling rack with the others. A row of gears, gray and unremarkable to look at, each one carrying its invisible character, the hard skin, the tough core, the tempered structure that would hold under load and resist wear and absorb shock without shattering. Parts that would go into the engine, parts that would, if the science held, run for years. If the science held, I looked at the row of finished gears and felt the thing I always feel at the end of a process, not satisfaction exactly, something more like provisional confidence. The metallurgy was complete, the recipe was recorded, the parts had rung true under Tahoe's hammer. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But the only way you ever really know if your science held, the proof range sat at the far edge of the ridge, a timber wall twice a man's height, thrown up against the hillside and packed behind with rammed earth. Doguang had designed it himself, and he had explained his philosophy to every apprentice who ever asked, and several who hadn't. If she's going to burst, she bursts now, talking to a timber wall, not in 3 months talking to a gun crew. That was the whole of it. No sentiment, no ceremony. Every barrel that came out of the foundry went to that wall before it went anywhere else, loaded past its service charge, fired by a long cord from behind a berm. The ones that held were guns. The ones that didn't were lessons. I had watched perhaps 40 proof firings by then, and had grown, if not comfortable with them, at least accustomed to the rhythm. The charge goes in, the crew walks back, the cord pulls taut, the world holds its breath for a fraction of a second that always feels longer than it is. This one did not hold. The barrel came apart in a single hard crack, not the rolling boom of a good discharge, but something shorter and more final, like a fist closing. Fragments struck the timber wall. Smoke rolled sideways across the range in the morning wind. Doguang was already moving before the echo died, his voice cutting through the haze. Down! The crew dropped by reflex, though there was nothing left to drop from. When the smoke thinned, the trunnion mount sat empty and scorched, and the barrel lay in 3 pieces in the dirt. No one was hurt. That was the point of the berm, the long cord, the timber wall. That was the point of all of it. But I stood at the edge of the range looking at those 3 pieces and felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. That barrel had passed every check we had. I called them together on the range itself, with the wreckage still where it had fallen. Baek Da-ho, Yun So-rin, Do-gwang, the 4 of us standing around the pieces like physicians around a body that had not yet been told it was dead. That barrel passed every check we have and still burst, I said. Our checks have a hole in them. We find it, today. Do-gwang looked at the shattered breech section without expression. Se-yin already had her ledger open. Taho crouched beside the largest fragment and said nothing, which with him meant he was already thinking. I had learned, in the years since I'd woken on this ridge with nothing but my grandfather's habits and a head full of processes that didn't yet have materials to run through, that the worst thing you can do after a failure is guess at it. Guessing feels like action. It has the shape of competence. But a guess applied to a broken part is just another way of hiding the flaw, and a hidden flaw is the only kind that kills you. We don't guess at it, I said. We diagnose it. This barrel is going to tell us exactly how it died. Taeho did the fracture reading first. He had the eye for it. He'd grown up watching his father break test bars and read the grain, and in the 2 years since I'd taught him what I knew of metallurgy, he had surpassed me in the tactile part of it. He turned the breech fragment in his hands, tilting it toward the light, running his thumb along the fracture face. The break had started deep inside the wall, not at the bore surface, not at the outer face, but in the middle of the metal itself, where no inspection had ever reached. The fracture surface there was different, older looking, with a dull, granular texture that stood apart from the bright crystalline shear of the final rupture, a pre-existing flaw, something that had been there since the pour, sealed inside the steel, invisible to every gauge and every eye. It started in the middle of the metal, Teho said, from a flaw already in there. Sorin looked up from her ledger. Her voice was level, the way it always was when she was most unsettled. So the question is, how did a flaw get sealed inside our steel, and how did it get past me? It was the right question. It was the only question. And the fact that she was asking it about herself, rather than about the foundry, or the poor crew, or anyone else, was why I trusted her more than anyone else on the ridge with a measuring instrument in her hands. She traced the barrel's history from the beginning. That was the thing about Salyin's ledgers. They were not records of outcomes, they were records of process. Every heat, every pour, every cooling time, every dimensional check, signed by the hand that performed it, time-stamped against the forge log, the chain of truth she called it, and she had built it step by step over 18 months until it covered every piece of iron that left our foundry. Every step signed, she said, turning pages with the focused economy of someone who has memorized the structure of her own filing system. Somewhere in this chain, a flaw walked in and nobody saw it. The records will tell me where. She found it in an hour. I was not surprised that she found it, only that it took as long as an hour. The batch this barrel had come from, cast 12 days ago, during the worst of the war pressure weeks, when the Empire's advanced scouts had been sighted 2 valleys east, and the warden had come to the foundry personally to ask whether we could double our output. That batch had a gap in the degassing record, not a falsification, not a deliberate omission. A step rushed past, a timing mark that showed the metal had been poured 20 minutes before the degassing hold was complete. 20 minutes. The difference between steel that had shed its dissolved gases cleanly and steel that had trapped them inside as it solidified, leaving voids sealed in the heart of the metal like pockets of absence waiting for the right pressure to become catastrophe. We sectioned the batch. Teho cut cross-sections from 3 other barrels at the forge, and we looked at what was inside them. The metal looked perfect from the outside, smooth bore, clean exterior, dimensions within tolerance on every check, and in the heart of 2 of them, visible only in section, the void sat like dark eyes looking back at us. The metal looks perfect, and it's rotten in the heart, Sorin said. I had been standing very still for the last several minutes. There is a particular quality of anger I have at myself, not hot, not loud, but very clear, and I was in the middle of it. Haste again, I said. Fast hit a flaw, and fast nearly killed people. We pull every barrel from that batch, now. The fix was not complicated. That was the thing about root cause work. The diagnosis is the hard part, and once you have the root cause, the correction is usually obvious. The flaw was internal casting voids from an incomplete degassing step. The degassing step had been rushed. Therefore, never rush the degassing step, enforce the hold time with a second signature, and add 2 new inspection steps to catch what had slipped past. The first new step was the tap test. Teho demonstrated it on the sectioned barrel, moving a small hammer along the outside of the wall in a grid pattern, listening to what came back. Tonk, dead, he said over a void. The sound was flat, absorbed, wrong. He moved the hammer. Ting, sound. This time the ring was clean and bright, the note of metal that was solid all the way through. He looked up. I can hear the rotten ones now. The second step was batch sectioning, 1 barrel from every pore cut open and examined before the rest of the batch was proof-fired. Destructive, expensive in material, non-negotiable. The third step was the hold time lock. No pore signed off without 2 witnesses to the completed degassing, and the timing recorded to the quarter hour. 3 new steps, I said, and that whole class of death is gone. That's what a failure is for. I meant it. I had meant it every time I had said something like it. Going back to the first cracked lathe bed in the first wooden machine shop. Going back further to my grandfather's bench where a misread micrometer had cost a week's work, and he had sat me down and walked through every step until we found where the error had entered. A failure that you understand is not a defeat, it is a specification. It tells you exactly what your process cannot yet do, and it tells you in terms precise enough to act on. The barrel that burst on the proof range had done more for the safety of every gun crew on the ridge than 100 barrels that held without telling us why. That did not make it comfortable to stand in front of the crews and say so. I gathered them at the range in the afternoon, the pour crew, the inspection crew, the proof team, the barrel handlers. Word had traveled fast, the way bad news always does in a small town under pressure. I could see it in the way they were standing, the particular stillness of people who are waiting to find out whether they are in trouble. I did not make them wait. The rush degassing had happened on my watch, under pressure I had not pushed back against hard enough. The inspection gap had happened because we had not yet built the tap test into our process, which was a gap in my process design. The barrel had burst because the system I had built was not yet complete. Those were the facts, and the facts were mine to carry. What I told them was this: the proof range had done exactly what it was built to do. The barrel had failed here, against a timber wall, with a long cord and a berm between the charge and any living person. It had not failed in 3 months on the wall, with a crew standing behind it. The system had caught the flaw. The system had worked. We find the weak ones here, I said, so they never find you out there. I watched them hear it. There is a difference between a crew that has been told something and a crew that has understood it, and you can see it happen if you are paying attention. The stillness changed quality, not relief exactly. There was still work to do, still barrels to pull, still a batch to condemn, but something that was the beginning of trust in the process rather than fear of it. Serene stayed after the others had gone back to work. She was closing her ledger, methodical as always, her brush moving down the final column of the day's entries. I watched her for a moment. Your fussy little ledgers just saved more lives than any cannon ever will, I said. The measure is the quietest weapon we've got, and the deadliest. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression was the one she wore when she was deciding whether something was worth the effort of a response. She decided it was not, which meant she agreed, which with Seorin was the highest form of acknowledgement. She closed the ledger and walked back toward the metrology room, and I stood alone on the proof range for a moment in the late afternoon light. The reproofed barrels went up to the wall 3 days later. Everyone from a clean batch, everyone tap tested and signed, everyone fired at proof charge and held. Do Guang walked the line of them in the early morning, running his hand along each breech in turn, the way a man checks a horse before a hard ride, not ceremonially, but with genuine attention, looking for anything that didn't feel right. He stopped at the end of the line and looked out over the ridge, toward the valley where the Empire's advance was still somewhere in the distance, moving toward us at whatever pace empires move. Every gun's been tried twice as hard as the Empire ever will, and held, he said. I'll not be sending anyone to die behind these. There was no theater in it. Do Guang did not do theater. It was simply a man who understood proof testing, saying what proof testing meant, in the plainest terms available. I had nothing to add to it. I stayed on the wall after he left, watching the light change over the ridge. The veil was visible at the edges of the sky, that pale dome that had been failing for as long as I had been here, its slow guttering the whole reason we were building what we were building. It looked the same as it always had. I had learned not to trust that. The barrels were sound. The process was sounder than it had been yesterday. 3 new steps stood between a rushed pour and a dead gun crew, and Sorin's ledgers would hold the chain of evidence for every barrel that would ever come off this ridge. The metal I could test. I had learned to read fracture faces, to hear the difference between a dead note and a live one, to trace a flaw back through a chain of signed records to the exact moment it had entered the work. The metal would tell you what it was if you asked it in the right language. The town was harder. Iron Ridge had grown fast under war pressure, faster than any settlement I had bootstrapped the process for, faster than the social structures that held people together could comfortably absorb. New workers from 3 valleys, old families displaced by the foundry's expansion, apprentices promoted past their experience, foremen carrying authority they hadn't had time to grow into. I had been watching it the way you watch a casting that's cooling too fast, waiting for the stress to find a weak point. You couldn't tap a hammer against a town and hear where the voids were. You couldn't section a batch of people and look at the grain. The flaws in a community under pressure were sealed just as deep as the ones in that barrel, and they didn't announce themselves. Machines came first. The city came after, the way rust follows iron left in rain, not planned, not designed, only inevitable. I set out to build a gear train. Somewhere in the grinding of that work, in the stacking of one solved problem atop another, Iron Ridge had become a place of thousands. Forges ran through the night. Children who had arrived hollow-eyed and silent now argued over geometry problems in the schoolroom. The smell of the town had changed. Coal smoke and hot metal, yes, but also bread and lamp oil and the particular noise that only comes when people believe they have somewhere to be in the morning. We set out to build machines. Somewhere in there we built a city. And a city is a far harder thing to keep true than a gear. A gear either meshes or it does not. You can measure the error, name it, correct it. A city has 10,000 points of contact, and the tolerance on human beings is not something you can hold with a caliper. Mukja said it plainly one evening, the way he always said things, without ornament, as though the words were simply facts he was reporting. He was sitting on the steps of the eastern dormitory, watching a group of apprentices carry timber across the yard in the last of the daylight. "A year and a half ago I was begging in a square," he said. "Sometimes I can't believe it's real." Chayoung was beside him, arms folded, watching the same scene. She did not look at him when she answered, "We made it real. That's the part nobody can ever take back." I had heard variations of that exchange more than once. It never stopped meaning something. These were people who had arrived at Iron Ridge with nothing, no family name, no land claim, no guild membership, no patron, and had been handed a set of calipers and a place at a workbench and told that the measure of their worth here would be the measure of their work. That was the promise. For a year and a half, we had kept it. But a city is not a workshop. A workshop has a foreman. A city has 1,000 foremen, and half of them are invisible, and the ones you cannot see are usually the ones doing the most damage. The resentments had been building since the second wave of newcomers arrived. I had watched it happen the way you watch a hairline crack in a casting, noting it, tracking it, hoping it would not propagate, knowing that hope is not a method. The old families, the ones who had stayed in Iron Ridge through the worst years, when the Vale was guttering and the mine shafts were flooding and half the town had already fled south, they had a grievance that was not entirely without logic. They had held the place when holding it meant something close to dying for it. They had earned their houses by surviving in them. And now, in the span of 18 months, the town had filled with strangers who had walked in after the hard work was done and received the same roofs, the same wages, the same seats at the schoolroom benches. The man who stopped Chiwal Young in the market square was not a bad man. That was the part that made it difficult. He was a tanner, third generation, whose grandfather had sunk the first drainage channel in the lower district. He had a son apprenticed to the forge and a daughter learning letters from Sorin. He had bled for this town in ways that were real and documented and deserved acknowledgement. "We held this town when it was dying." His voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a man who believed he was saying something obvious. "Now every beggar gets a house same as us. There's an order to things." G let him finish. She always let them finish. It was one of the things I had come to understand about her. She did not interrupt because she was not afraid of the argument. She had already heard it. She had already answered it, in her own mind, before the man opened his mouth. "The day Iron Ridge sorts people by blood, or by who got here first," she said, "we've rebuilt the thing we all ran from, and I will not allow it." She said it without heat. That was what made it land. Not a threat, not a lecture, a statement of fact, the way you state that a beam will fail at a given load. The tanner looked at her for a long moment, then looked away. He did not agree, but he did not argue further, because somewhere beneath the grievance he understood what she was saying, and understanding it made it harder to hold on to. G adjudicated by need and by work, not by birth. not by seniority, not by how long a family name had been attached to a plot of land. It was the only standard that did not eventually collapse into the same hierarchies we had dismantled, and she enforced it with the quiet, absolute consistency of someone who had decided once what the rule was, and had not revisited the decision since. The striver came to me in the machine hall, which was where people came when they wanted to talk to me about things that were not machines. I had learned to recognize the approach, the slight hesitation at the door, the eyes moving over the equipment as though taking inventory, the voice pitched a little too casually. Someone must own all this, he said. He was young, ambitious in the way that is not yet corrupted. He genuinely believed in what we were building. That was the part that required care. We could be lords here. I set down the file I was holding. We tore down a world of lords to build this, I said. You want to be a lord? There's an empire down the road full of them. Go join it. He left without answering. I did not think he would go, but I needed him to understand that the offer was not on the table, and that it would not be put on the table, and that asking again would not change that. G and I talked about it that night, in the way we talked about the things that mattered, not at a table, not formally, but walking the perimeter of the works, while the forges cooled and the town settled into its evening sounds. We could rule this place like a little kingdom and call it earned, she said, not advocating it, naming it, the way you name a failure mode so you can design against it. The knowledge stays open, the town stays fair, or none of this was worth what we paid for it. She nodded once. We kept walking. That was the compact between us, stated and restated in different forms over 18 months, always arriving at the same place. The moment Iron Ridge became the private property of the people who had built it, the moment we became a new court with new titles and new inherited privileges dressed in the language of merit, we would have proven nothing. We would have only demonstrated that power corrupts in the same direction regardless of how it begins. The knowledge had to stay open. The school had to stay open. The gates had to stay open. Or the machines were only a new set of chains, and we had simply replaced one set of lords with another. Sorin's schoolroom was the thing I was most proud of, and I was careful not to say that too often, because pride has a way of making people protect a thing rather than improve it. She had started with 12 students in a storage room. She now had 3 rooms, 2 assistant teachers, and a waiting list. The children came from everywhere, orphans from the dormitories, children of old Iron Ridge families, children of the newcomers, children of the maimed workers who could no longer swing a hammer but had not been sent away. They sat at the same benches. They learned the same letters, the same numbers, the same principles of weight and measure and mechanical advantage. We give knowledge to everyone, Sudin said, when someone asked her why she admitted the orphans at the same rate as the families who had been here for generations. That, more than any canon, is how the old world actually ends. She was right. I had known it as an abstraction before I came to Iron Ridge. Here I had watched it happen in practice, and the practice was more radical than the abstraction. A child who can read a gauge and calculate a load and understand why a joint fails does not need to take anyone's word for anything. She can measure it herself. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the whole thing. Doguang ran the safety instruction with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He had lost the sight in one eye to a forge accident in his 2nd month, before we had built the proper shields, before we had written the procedures that now governed every station in the works. He wore the loss without bitterness, which I had found harder to understand than bitterness would have been. He taught the new apprentices how to stand, how to move, where to position their bodies relative to moving metal, how to read the sounds a machine makes when something is about to go wrong. He had taught himself most of it through the experience of things going wrong, and he passed it on with the precision of someone who understood that the knowledge was worth more than the suffering it had cost him. One-eyed Tal worked beside him, a former soldier who had arrived with a wound that had not healed cleanly and a skill with edge tools that was, once we found the right application for it, extraordinary. The reformed clockmaker, whose name I never learned to pronounce correctly, had hands that shook too badly for fine assembly, but a mind for gear ratios that I had not encountered anywhere else in the ridge. We had found him a place at the drawing table, and the drawings he produced were cleaner than anything I could have made. None of them had been sent away, none of them had been told that their damage made them useless. A place that finds a use for its broken people, Do said, to a new cohort of apprentices who were watching him demonstrate the correct way to clear a jam from a press without losing a finger, is a place worth dying on a wall for. And I nearly did. I'd do it again. He said it without drama. The apprentices listened with the attention people give to someone who has already paid the cost of the lesson they're teaching. G raised the point about defense in a way that I had not considered, or had considered only abstractly. We were talking about the conscript armies the Empire sent to its border posts, men who had been pressed into service, who had no particular loyalty to the cause they were fighting for, who fought because the alternative was punishment. They were effective in sufficient numbers. They were not, in G's analysis, the same as what we had. Ours fight for the first home that ever wanted them, she said. I know which wall holds longer. I thought about it. The people of Iron Ridge, the orphans who now had trades, the maimed who had been given roles, the old families who had stayed through the worst years, the newcomers who had arrived with nothing and been handed dignity instead of charity. They had a stake, not a deed, not a title, not a legal claim that any court outside this valley would recognize, but something more durable than any of those things, the knowledge that this place had seen them and decided they were worth keeping. So fairness isn't only right, I said. It's armor. G looked at me with the expression she used when I had arrived at something she had known for longer than I had. Yes, she said, it is. The community night was Makje's idea, though he would not have called it that. He would have said he simply asked someone to bring a drum, and then someone else brought a flute, and then the food appeared the way food always appears when enough people decide that a meal should happen. The square was full, forge light and lamplight, and the light of a good fire built in the open air, and people who had come from a dozen different places and a dozen different kinds of difficulty sitting together and eating and listening to music that was not particularly accomplished but was entirely genuine. Children ran between the adults' legs. The apprentices from the eastern dormitory had claimed a section of the square and were teaching each other a dance that none of them knew correctly, which made it better. Mokje sat beside me for a while, watching it. This is what it's for, isn't it? He said. All the iron. It's for nights like this. Chayoung was on his other side. She reached over and took a piece of bread from the cloth between them without looking up. The machines were never the point, Jay, she said. This was always the point. I did not say anything. I had built machines for 18 months, and I had believed, in the way that engineers believe things, that the machines were the point, that if you got the tolerances right, and the processes correct, and the output consistent, the rest would follow. And the rest had followed. But sitting in that square, listening to the imperfect music, and watching the children argue about the steps of a dance nobody knew, I understood that Choyoung had the sequence right, and I had it backwards. The machines were the method. This was the measure. G found me at the edge of the square, near the hour when the fire had burned down to coals, and the music had gone quieter, and the children had been carried home by parents who were still humming. She was looking at the ridgeline to the south. I looked where she was looking. The fires were not ours. They were spread across the far ridge in a line too long and too evenly spaced to be anything other than deliberate, a military encampment, organized, substantial, the kind of encampment that does not appear for a patrol or a tax collector or a single column of soldiers making a point. Not a column this time, Smith. G's voice was level. Look how many fires, the Empire's real weight, come to make an example of us. I counted. I stopped counting. Let the music play tonight, I said. Tomorrow we go to the wall. She nodded. We stood there for a while longer, watching the fires on the ridge, and behind us the last of the music played on, a single flute, someone who did not yet know the night was over. I stayed at the edge of the square after G had gone to begin the preparations. The fires on the ridge were steady, no movement, not yet. They were making a point with their stillness. We are here, we are many, we are patient, and we have decided that you are a problem that requires our full attention. They were not wrong about the last part. I thought about what they were afraid of. Not the canon. We had canon now, and they knew it, and canon is something an empire understands and has answers for. Not the walls, not the forge, not the machine hall. Those were things that could be taken or destroyed and rebuilt somewhere else under new management. They were afraid of the school. They were afraid of what it meant that a one-eyed man was teaching safety procedures to orphans, and that a clockmaker with shaking hands was drawing gear trains that worked, and that children whose parents had arrived as beggars were learning to read gauges and calculate loads. They were afraid of the proof, not the proof that better machines were possible, the proof that a better arrangement of people was possible, that you could build a place where the measure of a person was the measure of their work and their care and their willingness to learn, and that place would not collapse, and the people in it would fight for it. That was the thing an empire could not allow to stand, not because it was a military threat, because it was an example. They're not afraid of our cannon, I said, to no one, to the fires on the ridge, to whatever part of myself still needed to say it out loud. They're afraid of our school. The fires burned on, patient and numerous. The army came at dawn, and it came like a tide, not a column, not the neat disciplined march of a patrol or an inspection force. A tide, the way water moves when there is simply too much of it to be stopped by the shape of the land. They filled the valley road, and then spilled off it, rank after rank pressing forward through the pine scrub and the frost-pale grass, banners catching the first gray light. I had seen their advance scouts 2 days before, and done the arithmetic. The arithmetic had not been encouraging. Ji Wol-young stood at the parapet above the eastern gate, watching them come. She was very still. The defenders around her were not, hands white-knuckled on crossbow stocks, breath coming in visible puffs in the cold air, someone's foot shifting and shifting again on the stone. She let them fidget. She waited until the leading ranks were close enough that she could read the formation, close enough that a shot would carry true, and then she turned to face the wall. "They've come to make us a lesson," she said. Her voice was level. "Then let's give them a lesson instead. Hold your fire for the range." Among the Empire's officers, at the edge of the command pavilion, Ryugyam stood apart from the generals and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for most of the campaign. The generals had stopped expecting him to speak. He was a court inspector, a man of records and measurements, and what use was a man of records when the business at hand was siege engines and numbers of dead? They had stopped looking at him. That suited him. It meant no one saw his face when the mage corps took their positions and began to channel. He watched them work. He watched the mandate answer, or try to answer. The old power moved through the core like water through a cracked vessel, arriving thin and wrong. The light it produced pale and unconvincing at the edges. At siege scale, with 100 channelers drawing at once, the failure was not subtle. It guttered, it spat. 2 of the junior mages simply sat down in the mud, drained to nothing in moments, and the senior corps master looked at Ryugyum across the pavilion, with an expression that asked a question Ryugyum did not want to answer. "We are not besieging a town," he thought. "We are besieging the future, and it does not run out of cannon." He had written that in a report. The report had been filed. He did not know if anyone had read it. The corps master raised his hands again, and the mandate flickered and held, barely, the way a lamp holds when the oil is nearly gone. Ryugyum looked at the failing light and thought of all the things he had measured and certified and recorded, all the standards he had carried from the capital to the frontier, and he thought, there is nothing left in it. We are a corpse swinging a sword out of habit. He did not say this aloud. There was no one to say it to. Iron Ridge answered. The cannon were spaced along the wall at intervals that Do-jin had calculated and Ji Wol-young had approved, sited for overlapping fields, and positioned so that the crews could serve them without crowding. They were not beautiful weapons, they were squat, Dark, practical things. Their bores true because the boring mill had made them true. Their touch holes clean because Mokje had spent 3 days teaching the crews how to clean them. They had been proof-fired. They had been measured. The crews knew their charges and their ranges because they had drilled the charges and the ranges until the knowledge lived in the body rather than the mind. Ji-Wol-young watched the tide advance. She waited. Then, "They've brought enough men to drown us if we waste a shot. Fire!" The wall shook, not with magic, with physics, with powder and iron, and the brute fact of a true bore driving a true ball on a true line. The volley was not simultaneous, which was correct. A simultaneous volley from a wall of cannon produces a single moment of chaos and then a long silence while everyone reloads. These were staggered. By the time the last gun on the east wall fired, the first gun's crew was already swabbing and measuring the next charge. The sound was continuous. The Empire's front ranks did not find a gap in it. I watched from the interior of the wall, where I had no business being except that Ji-Wol-young had told me to stay close, and I had not argued. I watched the volleys, and I watched the crews, and I thought, this is what a true bore looks like at range. This is what the boring mill was for. The satisfaction was not clean. There were men dying in the valley, but it was there, the way the satisfaction of a well-made thing is always there underneath whatever else you feel about it. Do Guang was everywhere at once, which was his gift. He had been safety master long enough that the town knew his voice the way it knew the sound of the forge, a constant, present thing, the sound of someone paying attention so that you could afford to pay attention to your own work. Now he moved along the wall and through the streets behind it, finding the places where fear was tipping toward collapse and arriving before it tipped all the way. The defenders were not soldiers, they were the people who had built this place, the refugees who had come through the eastern pass with nothing and been given work and a bed, the orphans from Unha's workshop who had grown up knowing how to measure and fit and finish, the old Iron Ridge families who remembered when the veil was strong and the ore ran easy, the men and women who had lost hands or eyes or the full use of a leg in the forge and the mill, and who were here anyway, serving powder or carrying water or holding a position because it was their wall and they had helped build it. Do moved among them, and he did not offer them comfort exactly, he offered them the thing they had already done. "You are the people who built this," he said, and his voice carried the way voices carry when they mean what they say, "and nobody takes what you built. Pour it back into them." They held, that is the plain fact of it. They held. But holding is not winning. I knew that. Ji-Wol-young knew that. Every person on that wall who had done any arithmetic at all knew that. The Empire had come with enough men to absorb what we could do to them and still have men left. They had siege engineers who had done this before, who knew how walls failed and where to push. They had supply lines that stretched back to a capital that did not know what it meant to run short of anything. We had a factory and a veil that was failing and a town full of people who were fighting because they had nowhere else to go. Holding isn't winning, I thought, watching the valley fill with the Empire's campfires as the first day wore on. Courage buys time. It doesn't buy a war. There has to be something we have that they don't. I did not have the answer yet. I kept looking for it. The breach came at mid-morning of the second day. The siege engines had been working the east wall since before dawn, not the mandate-powered constructions the Empire had relied on in previous campaigns, but heavy timber machines, counterweighted and crewed by teams of men who understood leverage and did not need magic to understand it. The wall there was old stone, older than the forge, older than Do-jin's arrival, and it had been repaired in places with newer work that did not quite match the original. The siege engineers had found the seam. Of course they had. That is what siege engineers are for. The crack ran up the wall in a line that was almost geometrically clean, and then a section of the parapet came down, and then the section below it, and the breach was open. Ji-Wol-young's voice cut through the noise from somewhere I couldn't see. "Breach on the east wall. All reserves. Plug it now, or they're inside the town." The reserves moved. They were not fast enough, and there were not enough of them, and the first wave of Empire soldiers came through the gap before the defenders could close it, and for a moment the east quarter of Iron Ridge was a very bad place to be. I saw what happened at the breach later, in pieces from people who had been there. Mokje had been running powder to the east wall guns when the section came down. He was 17 years old, and he had been my apprentice long enough to know how to measure a bore, and fit a coupling, and calculate a gear ratio, and none of that knowledge was useful to him in the moment the breach opened and the Empire's soldiers came through it. What was useful to him was that he had grown up in Iron Ridge, and the people around him had grown up in Iron Ridge, and they were all, in that moment, defending the same thing. Old Sock was at the breach. He had been one of the voices against the refugees in the early days. Not a cruel man, not a stupid man, but a man who had lived his whole life in a place that was his and had found the arrival of so many people who needed things frightening in the way that scarcity is always frightening. He had argued loudly. He had been wrong, and he had been told he was wrong, and he had spent the months since in the particular silence of a man who is reconsidering something he held for a long time. He was at the breach with a pike, and Mokje was at his left, and the Empire's soldiers were coming through. "Suk, I've got your left," Mok shouted. "Don't you dare go down, old man." "Mind your own flank, boy," Suk said, and then, a beat later, something different in his voice. "Good lad, push them back." They pushed them back. The breach held. It held because Suk covered the gap on the right side and kept it covered until the reserves arrived, and he was still covering it when the arrow found him, and he went down slowly, the way a man goes down when he has decided not to go down and his body has overruled him. One of the refugee women, she had come through the eastern pass 2 winters ago, with 3 children and the clothes they stood in, knelt beside him while the fighting was still loud at the edges of the breach. She had been carrying water for the defenders. She set down her bucket. "He called us beggars once," she said, "to no one in particular, to everyone. He died so my babies could live. We'll not forget him." Mokje stood at the edge of the sealed breach and looked at Sok, and looked at the refugee woman, and looked at the people around him, the old families, and the newcomers, and the orphans, and the maimed, all of them breathing hard, all of them marked by the same fight, and he thought something that he told me later, quietly, in the way he tells me things he has worked out and is not sure he has the right words for. "There's no them. There was never any them. There's just us, holding the wall." He was right. That is the plain fact of that too. Night came, and the Empire's fires filled the valley like a second town, larger than ours, patient in the way that large things are patient. We had held the wall. We had held the breach. We had paid for both in blood, and the Empire had paid in blood, and the Empire had more blood to spend than we did, and everyone on both sides of the wall knew it. Jiwa stood at the parapet in the dark, and looked at the fires and said what needed to be said. "They've got 30 more days in them. Holding isn't going to be enough." She was not asking me for an answer. She was stating a condition, the way an engineer states a constraint. Here is the boundary, now work within it. I had spent the day looking for the answer, and I thought I had found the edge of it, the place where it began. "They brought an army," I said. "We brought a factory. Tomorrow we stop trying to outfight them. We outlast them." The fires burned in the valley. The veil overhead was pale and thin, barely visible against the stars, the old mandate guttering down to almost nothing. Below it, in the forge-lit streets of Iron Ridge, the machinery was still running, the bellows turning, the mill wheel moving, the tools that we had built to build other tools waiting in the dark for morning. An army runs on what it carries. The Empire had mathematics on its side. It always did. 10,000 years of siege logic had refined the calculus to something almost elegant. Surround, cut off, wait. A town without supply lines was a town already dying. The army outside the walls needed only patience and the slow arithmetic of attrition. The Empire's commanders understood this. They settled their camp, rationed their certainty, and prepared to grind. Ji Wolyung stood at the parapet in the gray hour before dawn, looking out at the cook fires strung along the imperial line like a second constellation. She didn't look afraid. She looked like a woman working through a problem. They think they just have to wait, she said. Let's teach the Empire some new arithmetic, Smith. The works never went dark. That was the thing the Imperial commanders could not have accounted for, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. A besieged town was supposed to consume. It was supposed to burn through its stores of powder and shot and iron and men, each day's fighting drawing down the reserves until the arithmetic closed and the gates opened. The commanders had done this before. They knew how long things lasted. They did not know about the furnace. I remember standing in the works on the third night of the siege, the floor trembling faintly with the rhythm of the stamp mill, the air thick with charcoal smoke, and the copper smell of cooling iron. Baekdae-ho was at the casting floor, directing the pour on a new gun tube, the third that week. Mokje was at the bench with two apprentices, fitting a repaired breech block back into a carriage that had come in from the wall that morning. Around them the whole floor moved with a kind of furious, ordered purpose, ladle crews and mold setters and shot casters and the grinders working the finished rounds to dimension. It looked like chaos if you didn't know what you were watching. If you did, it looked like a clock. We didn't have an arsenal. We were one. I told back as much when he looked up from the mold and caught me watching. He wiped the sweat from his jaw with the back of his wrist and grinned, and it was the grin of a man who had found the exact right use for everything he'd ever learned. This furnace has fed a town, he said. It can starve an empire. From across the floor, not looking up from the breech block, Mukja called out, "We're faster than they can break them." He wasn't wrong. The Empire's siege guns were destroying our artillery at a rate their commanders had calculated with care. What they had not calculated was that we were replacing the guns faster than they were destroying them. Every piece that came off the wall broken went back to the works and came back whole, or was melted and recast into something better. Every round expended was replaced before the barrel cooled. The rotating crews, Dogwang's insistence, drilled into them through the weeks before the siege, meant no battery ever went silent from exhaustion. The men rested, the guns did not. The inversion happened slowly, then all at once. The Empire's supply lines ran 200 li back to the nearest depot. Ours ran 50 paces from the wall to the casting floor. Every day the Imperial Army held the siege, their powder reserves drew down, their shot stocks diminished, their horses ate through forage that had to be hauled from farther and farther away. Every day we held, we made more than we had the day before. The attrition was running in the wrong direction, and somewhere around the fifth day the Empire's commanders must have begun to feel it, though perhaps they could not yet name what they were feeling. Dogwang walked the batteries every morning like a physician making rounds, checking the guns, checking the crews, checking the powder stores with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He had no patience for heroics and none for despair. What he had was process. "We don't burst because we tested," he said, to no one in particular and everyone at once, moving along the line with his hands clasped behind his back. "We don't run dry because we make more. Just keep firing. We simply do not stop." The crews kept firing. Ryugyam watched from the eastern tower. He had been given observer's quarters there, a courtesy to his rank, or perhaps a way of keeping him contained where he could be watched in turn. He spent most of his time at the narrow window, looking down at the works, at the wall, at the Imperial camp beyond. His face, when I passed him in the corridor on the sixth day, was unreadable in the way that faces become when a man has finished arguing with himself and arrives somewhere he doesn't much like. I didn't know then what he was thinking. I learned it later, the way you learn most things about men like Ryugyam, in pieces from what they say when they believe no one consequential is listening. They outmake us. They will always outmake us, because they let anyone make. He had understood it completely, which was its own kind of tragedy. The old order wasn't being defeated on that wall. It was being rendered obsolete, which is a different and more permanent thing. You can negotiate with a defeat. You can absorb it, explain it, wait for the wheel to turn. You cannot negotiate with obsolescence. The mandate wasn't being broken. It was being buried under the weight of a process that didn't require it, didn't reference it, didn't need its permission to function. The mandate isn't being defeated, it's being buried. He stood at the window and watched us make, and he understood, and there was nothing in his understanding that resembled hope. On the ninth day, the Empire's army withdrew. It happened in the early afternoon, the kind of flat gray autumn afternoon that seems designed to drain drama from everything. There was no final assault, no dramatic last stand. The Imperial camp simply began to come apart, tents struck, wagons loaded, the long columns forming up and turning south along the road they had come in on. From the wall it looked almost orderly, which was its own kind of statement. They were not routing, they were retreating, which is what an army does when it has done the mathematics and found the answer wrong. Jiwa Young stood on the parapet and watched them go. Around her, the wall crews were beginning to make noise, not cheering exactly, not yet, something more ragged and disbelieving than cheering. She let it run for a moment before she spoke, and when she spoke it was quietly, almost to herself, though I was close enough to hear. A frontier town full of orphans and refugees just beat the Empire's main host. A pause. Nobody will believe it. Another pause, longer. They'll have to. We had not outfought them. That was the thing I kept returning to in the days that followed, turning it over the way you turn a piece of finished iron to check for flaws. We had not been braver, or more skilled, or better led, though we had been all of those things in their measure. What we had done was outmake them. The works had done what I had built it to do, which was sustain. A place that makes its own everything faster than you can destroy it, doesn't run out, doesn't break, doesn't starve, it simply continues. Continuity, in the end, is what wins sieges, and we had built continuity into the stone. Ji Wol-young found me in the works that evening, standing at the casting floor where the molds were already being set for the next pour, because the next pour was already planned, and there was no reason to stop. "The thing you built to keep us alive when the veil died," she said, "just killed an empire's certainty." I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure one was needed. Then came the counting. Yun So-rin had her ledgers out before the last imperial column had cleared the ridge. She moved through the town with her apprentice at her shoulder, recording everything with the same precision she brought to calibration: the structural damage, the stores consumed, the guns lost and replaced, and the dead, especially the dead. Sok was among them. He had held a section of the northern wall through the sixth night and into the seventh morning, and he had not come off it. I had known him since the early days of the works, one of the first men who had looked at what I was trying to build and decided, without much deliberation, that he would help build it. He had not been a remarkable man in any way that would make him easy to describe. He had been reliable, which is the thing I notice first and value most, and now he was gone, and reliability has a weight to it when it's absent. Yun So-rin stood before the wall where the names were being inscribed and spoke to the town clerk without looking up from her ledger. "Write their names, old families and refugees, the same list, the same honor. They held the same wall." The clerk wrote. The names went down together, in the same hand, in the same ink, on the same stone. Whatever distinctions had mattered before the siege, who had been born here, who had come in hungry from the roads, who had been granted papers and who had not, the wall had settled the question in its own way. They had held it together. The record would say so. The grief and the relief ran together through the town in the days that followed, the way two streams run together after a heavy rain, neither one quite distinguishable from the other. People who had not spoken before the siege found themselves sharing meals. Old families who had resented the refugees found themselves unable to remember exactly why, or found the memory present but somehow weightless, the way an old injury sometimes stops aching without your noticing the moment it stopped. Baktaho sat across from me at the works bench 2 days after the withdrawal, a cup of barley tea going cold between his hands, staring at the casting floor with an expression I had not seen on him before. "We beat the Empire, Smith," he said. "How is any of this real?" Cho-young, passing behind him with a stack of mold frames, didn't break stride. "It's real because we made it real," she said. "Same as everything." Bak looked at the floor for a moment, then nodded and picked up his tea. Ryugam left on the third day after the withdrawal, before the last of the imperial dead had been properly attended to. He rode out through the south gate in the early morning with 2 attendants and no ceremony, which was how he had arrived and which suited him. I watched him go from the gate tower. He did not look back. Men who have arrived at a conclusion rarely do. Later I would learn what he had been thinking in those last days, or something close to it, the shape of his understanding, if not its precise texture. It was over the day he touched the anchor. I'm the only one who stopped pretending. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps the rest of us were still pretending, in the way that people who are building something must always pretend a little, must hold the finished shape in mind against the unfinished reality, and act as though the gap between them is crossable, because if you stop believing that, you stop crossing. Ryugam had stopped. He had looked at what we were building and seen clearly what it meant for everything he represented, and he had chosen comprehension over pretense and ridden away into a world that was already, irrevocably, not his anymore. I didn't pity him. I'm not sure pity was the right instrument for what he was, but I understood him better than I had, which is its own kind of thing. The story left Iron Ridge before the month was out. Traders carried it south along the mountain roads, refugees carried it east toward the coast, soldiers who had served in the imperial army and survived the withdrawal carried it home in their packs like contraband, something they hadn't meant to bring back but couldn't leave behind, a frontier town, a failing vale, orphans and refugees, and a furnace that never went cold. They beat the Empire's main host and came out of it with more guns than they'd started with. Every dying frontier that heard it asked the same question. I know this because the letters began arriving, cautious letters, from headmen and minor lords and desperate town councils in places I had never heard of, asking careful questions about furnaces and molds and the particular mathematics of making your own shot. They didn't always use those words, but that was what they were asking. What if we made our own? That question, once loose in the world, does not go back in. You cannot besiege it, cannot starve it, cannot send an army sufficient to surround it and wait it out. It travels on its own, finds its own footing, takes root in whatever ground is desperate enough to receive it. The empire could defeat armies. It could not defeat an idea that had already demonstrated its arithmetic. That was the future, arriving, not with banners or proclamations, but in the quiet way that useful things arrive, one question at a time, in letters written by tired men in cold rooms, asking whether what they had heard. Dawn came up gray over Iron Ridge, and for the first time in 2 years no one was watching the ridgeline for dust. The Empire's main column had broken 3 days prior, not routed in the romantic sense, not scattered into the pine hills, but broken the way a tool breaks when it meets something harder than itself, methodically, irreversibly. The siege lines were still visible from the south gate, churned earth and abandoned fire pits, the geometry of a campaign that had assumed its conclusion and found otherwise. Jiwol-young stood at the parapet above the gate and looked at what remained of it for a long time without speaking. The morning light caught the scars on the outer wall, the patched sections where the new iron-reinforced facing had taken hits that the old timber and daub would never have survived. The town behind her was still standing. That was the whole fact of it. 2 years ago, a dying town that couldn't forge a spear, she said at last. This morning, the town that beat the empire. She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at me. I keep waiting to wake up. I was standing 2 paces behind her, still carrying the grime of the last 3 days. I had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since the column moved on the outer works. My hands were bandaged at the knuckles where I'd caught a splinter from a shattered gate brace, and I was aware, distantly, that I was very tired in a way that would not be resolved by one night's rest. But the wall was standing, and the town was behind it. It's real, Warden, I said. We'll spend our lives making sure it stays that way. She nodded once, slowly, and kept looking at the empty ridge. The envoys arrived 4 days later. Not soldiers, envoys, court-robed, traveling under the Empire's formal seal, arriving in a lacquered carriage that was conspicuously unarmed and conspicuously attended by only a small retinue. They came with documents. They came to negotiate. Ji Young received them in the hall that had been the old magistrate's chamber, now serving as the town's administrative center. She sat at the head of the table, with the composure of someone who had already decided how this meeting would end before it began. I watched from the side of the room as the lead envoy laid out the empire's terms, carefully worded, carefully hedged, the language of a court that had not yet admitted to itself what had actually happened. Young listened to all of it without interrupting. When the envoy finished, she was quiet for a moment. They came to erase us, she said, and now they're negotiating with us. She looked at the documents on the table without touching them. That's not a treaty. That's an abdication wearing court manners. The envoy had no answer for that. The documents were signed before sundown. The morning came before the celebration, as it should have. Yoon So-rin had compiled the roll herself. She had worked on it for 3 days, cross-referencing the town's records against the refugee intake lists, the old family registers, the names that the original inhabitants had kept in their heads because there had been no official record to hold them. The result was a single document, read aloud in the square on the 5th morning after the siege lifted, in front of everyone who could stand to be there. The names ran long. Some of them I recognized, some I had never known, people who had died in the early months before I had understood what I was building toward, before the Vale's slow failure had made the stakes undeniable. Old Iron Ridge families who had held on through decades of the town's decline, refugees who had arrived with nothing and built themselves into the fabric of what we were making. So-rin read each name in the same level voice, without inflection, without distinction. When she finished, she rolled the document carefully and held it in both hands. There is no old Iron Ridge and new Iron Ridge anymore, she said. There is only Iron Ridge, and it owes every name on this list the same debt. No one spoke for a while after that. The square was very quiet. The veil overhead, still present, still faint, its pale dome dimmer than it had been 2 years ago, but holding, caught the morning light and scattered it in the way it had always done, the way I had stopped noticing and then started noticing again after the siege, the way you notice something you might lose. Baek Tae-ho found me in the works that afternoon. He had aged in 2 years, we all had, but the aging suited him in the way it suits a man who has grown into the full weight of what he knows. He was standing at the center of the main forge floor, looking at the full chain of it, the ore bins at the back, the blast furnace with its tuyers and its tap hole, the puddling furnace beside it, the rolling frames, the quench tanks, the hardening hearths, the racks of finished stock, wrought iron, cast iron, blister steel, shear steel, the whole road from raw ore to hardened tool steel, every step of it built from scratch in 24 months. The whole road, Smith, he said, not looking at me. I never dared dream a road this long. I stood beside him and looked at it with him. I had spent enough time in this room that I no longer saw it the way a visitor would. I saw the things that still needed adjustment, the tap hole that had been patched twice and would need a proper rebuild before the next campaign, the rolling frame whose drive shaft had developed a slight wobble I hadn't had time to address. But I understood what he was seeing, and I let myself see it with him for a moment. End of this road, I said. There's another starting where it stops. We can make any metal now. Can we make it perfect? He turned to look at me then, and I could see him working through what I meant. I showed him the 2 objects I had been carrying in my coat for the past week. The first was a crankshaft blank, forged, rough-shaped, the correct alloy, strong enough to take the loads I had calculated. It was good work. Tahoe had made it, and it was as good as anything I could have specified. I set it on the bench. The second was a single gear, small, cut from the same steel, but cut by hand to a tooth profile I had laid out with a dividing plate and a scraper, and 3 days of work I would not get back. I set it beside the crankshaft blank. An engine isn't just strong parts, I said. It's precise ones, spinning true thousands of times a minute. I picked up the gear and held it to the light from the furnace door. The teeth caught the orange glow. gears, bearings, the last mountain before the engine itself. Teho looked at the gear for a long time. He reached out and took it from me, turned it in his fingers, felt the tooth profile with his thumb, the way a man who has spent his life reading metal reads it. How precise? He asked. More than we've ever held, I said, consistently. Every gear the same, every bearing the same. Not close, the same. He set the gear back down on the bench next to the crankshaft blank and looked at the two objects together. Then that's the next road, he said. The envoys from the other towns had been arriving in ones and twos for a week before Wolyung brought it to my attention formally. They were not the Empire's envoys. They were representatives of frontier towns, border settlements, places that had been watching what Iron Ridge had done from a distance and had sent people to find out how. Some of them were desperate, towns where the veil had already failed, where the old mandate had guttered out entirely and left nothing in its place. Some of them were simply practical, administrators and craftsmen who had looked at what we had built and understood that the world had changed and they needed to change with it. Wolyung brought me to the receiving room where three of them were waiting. They don't want our charity, Smith, she said. They want to learn to do what we did. I looked at the three men and women across the table. One of them had traveled 11 days. One of them had a town with a working ore deposit and no one who knew how to smelt it. One of them had a forge master who had been trying to rebuild a blast furnace from memory and getting it wrong in ways that were going to get someone killed. Then we teach them, I said. What we gave them was not a secret, that was the point. We spent 2 weeks assembling what I thought of as the full kit, not just the knowledge in my head, but the knowledge made transferable. Grade books with the full ore-to-steel process documented in steps simple enough that a literate forge apprentice could follow them. Master gauges, reference standards, the flat plates and straight edges and angle blocks that Surin's measurement work had produced, copied and copied again, each copy checked against the original, toolkits with the instruments needed to verify your own work, and teachers. That last part was the hard part, not because we lacked people, we had trained more than I had expected in 2 years of necessity, but because sending them away meant Iron Ridge would feel the absence. Knowledge hoarded is just a crown, I said, when Wolyung raised the question of what we were giving up. Knowledge given away is a world waking up. That's the only victory the Empire can never take back. She looked at me for a moment with the expression she used when she was deciding whether she agreed with something or was simply going to act as if she did. Then she nodded. Choyoung got her assignment on a Tuesday morning. She had been one of the orphan masters since the early days, one of the first apprentices who had come to us with nothing and learned to measure, to scrape, to hold a standard. She was not yet 20. She had grown up in the market square of Old Iron Ridge, running errands for the stall keepers, sleeping where she could. She had hands that had learned precision the hard way, by repetition and failure and the slow accumulation of feel. She stood in the yard with her kit packed and her assignment in hand, and looked at it with an expression I could not entirely read. I'm to teach a whole town to scrape true, she said. Me? A pause. The rat from the market square? Teho was standing nearby. He had been watching her pack with the quiet attention he gave to things he considered important. Same as the Outlander taught us, he said. Strangest and best road I ever walked. She looked at him, then back at her assignment. Then she shouldered her kit and walked toward the gate. That evening I went back to the place where I had woken up. 2 years ago, almost to the month, I had been lying in the mud of a failed ore survey in a dying town at the edge of a dying kingdom, with no tools and no materials and no one who understood what I was trying to do. The veil had been brighter then, not healthy, but brighter. Now it was a thin thing, a suggestion of dome rather than a dome, and on clear nights you could see stars through it that you hadn't been able to see before. I stood there for a while in the cooling air and thought about what I had set out to do and what had actually happened. The whole point was to make myself unnecessary. That was the thought that came to me, standing in that particular spot, and I'm almost there. The seed isn't supposed to stay the biggest thing in the garden. Chayoung was on the road to a town 11 days east. carrying the three-plate method and a set of master gauges and 2 years of hard-won knowledge in her hands. Teo's apprentices were teaching Teo's methods to men who would teach them to others. Sorin's gradebooks were being copied in 3 towns I had never visited. The thing I had started was no longer mine in the way it had been at the beginning, and that was exactly right. I stayed there until the light changed, and then I walked back to the works. Teo was waiting for me at the forge door. He had the gear in his hand again, the one I had cut, the one I had shown him that afternoon. He was turning it in his fingers in the way he turned things when he was thinking. "And then the engine itself," he said when I reached him, "a heart that burns." "And then the thing it goes in," I said, "a machine that needs no veil, no mandate, no Lord's permission to exist." I took the gear back from him and looked at it. "That's the whole dream." He was quiet for a moment. Behind us, through the open forge door, the furnace was banked for the night, but still breathing heat, the coals orange and slow. "Then we'd better get the gears right first," he said. They were all there by the time the furnace light reached its evening depth. Wolyang and Sorin and Teho and Doguang, the people who had built this with me, standing in the yard of the works with the glow of the forge behind them, and the thin dome of the veil overhead, and the smell of charcoal and iron in the air, the way it always was here now, the way it had come to mean something to me that I did not have a clean word for. Doguang had a cup in his hand and was looking at the works with the expression of a man taking inventory of something he values. "From a dying husk to the town that beat the empire, in 2 years," he said, "I'd not trade a single mile of it." Wolyung stood at the edge of the group with her arms folded, looking at the forge light on the walls of the yard. "And it's not done," she said, "not while there's a heart that burns to build." No one argued with that. Later, after the others had gone in, I stood alone at the forge door and held the gear up to the furnace light. The teeth threw small shadows. The face of each tooth caught the orange glow and gave it back in a slightly different color, the way hardened steel does when the surface is right. It was good work. It was not good enough, not for what came next, not for the tolerances an engine demanded, not for parts that would spin true thousands of times a minute under load. But it was the shape of the problem. It was the thing I could see clearly now, that the last 2 years had cleared the ground. Fire had given us the bones, the ore chain, the alloy work, the hardening, all of it was solved, or solved enough to build from. What remained was different in kind, not strength, not heat, precision, the ability to make a gear and then make another gear exactly like it, and another, and hold that standard across every part of every machine we would ever build. Gears, bearings, the lead screw that would cut other lead screws, the surface plate that would prove other surface plates, the whole self-referential architecture of a measurement system that could sustain itself. And after that, the engine, the crankshaft spinning in its bearings, the valves timed to the thousandth, the heat of combustion turned into motion, turned into work, the heart that burns. And after that, the thing it would go in, the machine that needed nothing from the old order to exist, no mandate, no veil, no Lord's seal on a document, just iron and fire, and the knowledge of how to put them together. I lowered the gear and looked at the furnace. "Fire gave us the bones," I said to no one. "Now, precision, and then a heart that burns."